What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? It's Daniel, and welcome back to our video. Today, I'll be ranking the top 100 greatest NASCAR Cup Series drivers of all time. I'm going to go through 100 to number 1, and there's also going to be an honorable mentions portion of this episode at the end. So anyways, let's go ahead and just jump straight into it. In the 100th position, I have Eddie Pagan. Eddie Pagan scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 27 top 5s, 38 top 10s, and did this in 62 starts. Eddie Pagan was one of the pioneers of NASCAR. A lot of his success coming in the mid-1950s and in the early 1960s as well. Was a legend of the sport in the early portion of history, was great in the Strictly Stock Series, and did a lot of great things and accomplished a lot in a very short period of time. Winning big races in his career, he did a really good job for the sport in the early portion of history, and he currently sits 100th on my list. In the number 99 position, I have Nelson Sacy. Nelson Sacy scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1961 Southern 500, the 1962 Coca-Cola 600, had 13 top 5s, 24 top 10s, and did this in only 45 starts. If I'm not mistaken, Nelson Sacy was notably known for racing for the Wood Brothers, and I believe in the 50s and the 60s, and winning the Southern 500 and the Coca-Cola 600. Those are 2 of the biggest crown jewel events. He was very successful in the early 1960s, I think competing from the late 1950s up until the early to mid 1960s. He had a ton of success, won some pretty big races in his career, and was able to accomplish a lot in this sport in a short period of time, and was one of those drivers that was an early pioneer of this sport, being a really successful race car driver in the mid and early 1960s. In the number 98 position, I have Joe Nemechek, also known as Front Row Joe. Joe Nemechek scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 18 top 5s, 62 top 10s, and did this in 674 starts. Joe Nemechek competed in NASCAR for a very, very long time. He won a Busch Series championship in the early 1990s. He also, of course, won with multiple organizations. He won with Hendrick Motorsports in 2003. He won in the 01 car for the MB2 Motorsports team at Kansas Speedway in 2004. He also won races with Felix Sabates and was also able to win in a 33 car for Andy Peachard Raceway at Rockingham Speedway in 2001. He was also known for being a really great pole sitter, as he won a ton of poles in the NASCAR Cup Series, including winning one with Furniture Racing in 2008. We know success that Joe Nemechek had in the mid to early 2000s. Also had a team that was around in the Xfinity Series for a very, very long time, and won some pretty big events in his career. He was able to sweep Kansas in 2004 in the Xfinity Series in the Cup Series weekend, and he did have a lot of success in this sport. He was around for many years. His son is currently competing in the NASCAR Cup Series, that being John Hunter Nemechek for Legacy Motor Club, and was able to score a couple major wins in his NASCAR Cup Series career. In the number 97 position, I have Michael Waltrip. Michael Waltrip scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 Daytona 500s, those coming in 2001 and 2003. He had 41 top 5s, 133 top 10s, and did this in 784 starts. When a lot of people talk about Michael Waltrip, they nowadays kind of talk about how his commentary really is not that great in the Truck Series. But as a competitor, Michael Waltrip was actually a very solid race car driver. He won the All-Star race in 1996 and is one of the best super speedway racers in history. When he drove for DEI, he was very successful in super speedways. He won, of course, like I mentioned, won 2 Daytona 500s in 2001 and 2003. He also won at Daytona in the summer race in 2002, and he also won at Talladega in 2003 as well. If you go back to that 2003 season, Michael Waltrip was a top 5 contender for a majority of the season until the end of the year, where they kind of had to collapse near the end of the season. Michael Waltrip was still a very solid driver in his time. Did have some big moments when Dale Earnhardt gave him the chance and opportunity to drive for DEI. He did a very solid job for a few years. Then he went on to own his own organization that nearly won a championship in 2012 with Clint Boyer, and they're able to have quite a bit of success. But Michael Waltrip goes no higher. He is number 97 on my list. In the number 96 position, I have Billy Wade. Billy Wade scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 16 top 5s, 41 top 10s, and did this in 70 starts. Billy Wade won the Rookie of the Year honors, I believe, in 1963 or 1964, and all of his success really came in the mid-1960s. He didn't win any major big races, but was very consistent and upfront. When you win more races, basically have more top 10s in the starts you have, or basically more than half your race you finish in the top 10, you are still a very solid driver in this sport. This is a driver that's kind of gotten forgotten in history, and I wish people wouldn't forget him because he did have a ton of success in the mid-1960s. He won some big races in his time, got a lot of success, did some pretty good things in the 1960s. I think he's innovated some things as well and was able to be a pretty solid driver back in the day. Billy Wade is currently number 96 on this list. In the number 95 position, I have Glenn Wood. Glenn Wood scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 22 top 5s, 34 top 10s, and did this in 62 starts. Glenn Wood is more known for being one of the original co-owners of the Wood Brothers organization. If I'm not mistaken, he's either in the Hall of Fame or been at times very close to making the NASCAR Hall of Fame as well. He was an engineer. He built up the Wood Brothers to be very solid back in the early days and did win some pretty big races. I think he won in Martinsville in the 1950s and helped build the Wood Brothers organization up to where they're kind of at today, though in recent years the organization has kind of fallen off with Harrison Burton. So I think Glenn Wood has been a really solid driver in his time, was a great driver back in the day, and I think he did accomplish some pretty big things in his racing career. He did some great stuff, and he sits in number 95 on my list. In the number 94 position, I have Morgan Shepherd. Morgan Shepherd scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 63 top 5s, had 168 top 10s, and did this in 517 starts. Morgan Shepherd had one of the longest tenured racing careers in NASCAR history. He competed from the 1970s, and really his last Cup Series start came in 2014, driving a 33 car for Circle Sport, where he had some controversy with another driver to be on the list later, that being Joey Logano. Morgan Shepherd, though, was very successful at tracks like Atlanta Motor Speedway. If I'm not mistaken, I think 3 of his 4 big wins did come at Atlanta Motor Speedway. Just was really good there in the 90s and did have success up to that point. He actually had a chance to finish in the top 5, I think, in 1990 or 1991, and he stuck around for many years after that, owning an Xfinity Series team, which was around for a long time, had the Racing for Jesus sponsorship, among other things, that was able to carry on for a very long time. Morgan Shepherd did have a lot of success in the sport, owning a team, winning races. He won like 20 races in Xfinity, if I'm not mistaken, so he won a lot of big races back then, and Morgan Shepherd stuck around in the sport for a very long time, driving for teams like Bud Moore. He drove that 47 car, which won him his first ever race in NASCAR Cup Series competition, 1981, and overall Morgan Shepherd had quite a bit of success back in the day in the sport. So Morgan Shepherd did a lot of great things, also drove for the Wood Brothers, and was able to accomplish a lot in his day back in the 80s and the 90s as well. In the number 93 position, I have Ken Schrader. Ken Schrader scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 64 top 5s, did this and had 184 top 10s, and did this in 763 starts. Ken Schrader to this day is still racing, but he had a long tenure career from the 1980s up until the early to mid 2010s. Ken Schrader, all of his wins came with Hendrick Motorsports. He was very solid back in the day with Hendrick Motorsports from the late 1980s up until 1996 when he left the team at the end of that season to go drive the 33 car, I think for Leo Jackson, if I'm not mistaken. He did have a lot of success with Hendrick Motorsports, picking up all his wins there. He was able to win a Dover, I think, back in 1991. He also won his first race at Talladega in 1988, and also nearly won the Daytona 500 in 1989, and won 3 straight Daytona 500 pole awards as well in that number 25 car. He was a big proponent in helping Hendrick Motorsports build up their program and organization, and had quite a bit of success back in the day as well. To this day, he is still racing and thriving. He's been racing for a long time, and he still continues to race to this day. He's still competing. He raced in the SRX last year, and he had a lot of success, but Ken Schrader currently sits in number 93 on my list. In the number 92 position, I have Parnelli Jones. Parnelli Jones scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 6 top 5s, and 11 top 10s, and did this in only 34 starts. Parnelli Jones raced in the early days of NASCAR from the late 1950s up until the early to mid 1960s, with his last win, I believe, coming in either 1966 or 1963. He won at Riverside Speedway. It was one of the few drivers who competed in Formula One who also went on to win in NASCAR. There's only about 3 or 4 drivers who've raced in F1 that have come to win in NASCAR. That being Mario Andretti, Juan Pablo Montoya, and of course, not Parnelli Jones. He didn't win in F1. That's another driver we'll talk about later. But Parnelli Jones is a very, very solid driver back in the day. Had a lot of success, also winning, I think, the Indianapolis 500 as well, and brought the Jones family into light. He had a ton of success. Raced in other forms of racing, was very solid. Won 3 USAC Champ Car races as well, and was able to accomplish a lot in the early days of NASCAR and other forms of racing as well. In the number 91 position, I have Herschel McGriff. Herschel McGriff scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He had 17 top 5s, had 31 top 10s, and did this in 85 starts. Despite the fact that Herschel McGriff only had 85 starts in the NASCAR Cup Series, he ran in the sport from the beginning of the time from 1949 to 1950 up until the end of his time, which was 1993 and 1994. And up until about 2018, he was still racing at the age of 86 years old in the NASCAR ARCA West Series, which ARCA West took over the K&N Pro Series back in 2019 or 2020. A few years prior to that, he did race there. Herschel had a long 10-year career. All 4 of his wins, I believe, came in one season, that being in 1954. While he didn't race much, he had a lot of success in a short period of time, and recently got inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame back in 2023 for all he accomplished in a short period of time. He was very successful, very, very solid, had a long tenured career. He's been racing for many years. He's not currently racing at the moment, but he's been doing a lot of great things outside of the sport. It was really awesome and cool to see that he finally got inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. He currently sits number 91 on my list. In the number 90 position, I have Charlie Glotzback. Charlie Glotzback scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 38 top 5s, 50 top 10s, and did this in 124 starts. The most notable thing that Charlie Glotzback did, which was his final win, which is the 1971 Volunteer 500, I believe he either led every single lap in that race or won the fastest race in Bristol history. He was a really solid driver in the 1960s and the early 1970s as well, and brought a lot of success to the table, driving, I think, for teams like Holman Mooney Racing, among other organizations as well. He did some pretty great things in the sport, was around for a very long time, unfortunately was involved in that really, really scary accident. I think that happened when they brought a lot of the old veterans who raced many years ago at the Battle of Bristol back in 2009 or 2010. But he still was a very solid driver in his day. He had a lot of success and did a lot of great things in NASCAR in the early days of this sport. In the number 89 position, I have Bobby Hamilton. Bobby Hamilton scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 20 top 5s, 67 top 10s, and did this in 371 starts. Bobby Hamilton won a couple pretty big races in his day. He won with Petty Enterprises in 1996 or 1997 at Phoenix Raceway, driving a number 43 car. He won with Morgan McClure Racing in the 4 car in 1998 at Martinsville. He also won a course in 2001 at Talladega, and I think he also won a race in 2000 as well. Bobby Hamilton was around for a very, very long time in the racing world. But the most notable thing he did was outside of the Cup Series, where he won a Truck Series championship in 2004, driving for his own organization. He made sporadic starts basically after he basically retired from full-time racing Cup, which is 2002 was the last year he raced before transitioning over to the Truck Series full-time starting in 2003, where he had a good chance and opportunity to compete there. He had a lot of success in the sport, was around for many, many years. He sadly passed away in 2007, unfortunately, and his career could have still continued for a very long time after that. He still had a ton of success, won some pretty big races, won in Martinsville as well, and got some massive and pretty huge wins throughout his NASCAR Cup Series career, which he was around in Cup for a very, very long time. In the number 88 position, we have Pete Hamilton. Pete Hamilton only won 4 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1970 Daytona 500, had 26 top 5s, 33 top 10s, and did this in 64 starts. Pete Hamilton was mostly known for winning at super speedway tracks. Like I mentioned, he won the 1970 Daytona 500, but if I'm not mistaken, he also won at Talladega, I think either in that season or in 1971. He was known for being one of the first big gray super speedway drivers, and also, like I mentioned, I think, drove for Petty Enterprises when that team is still up and coming. And we know the success of Petty Enterprises, where he drove a second car when I believe Richard Petty was still racing NASCAR, because I think in the mid-1960s, Richard was off doing drag racing. Pete came around, didn't really race a ton, but when he did, he was very solid and very, very successful. Had some pretty big success, won some pretty big races, and currently sits 88th on the list, with him, of course, being able to win that Daytona 500, which not a ton of drivers have been able to accomplish in their racing careers. In the number 87 position, I have Bob Flock, the first of the three Flock brothers in the Flock family. Bob Flock won 4 races in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 11 top 5s, 18 top 10s, and did this in only 36 starts. Had Bob Flock decided to compete in a lot more races back in the day, I do believe that Bob Flock would have been able to win a lot more races in Cup, because he was a really great driver in the early days of the sport and basically decided to give up his driving duties to focus on an ownership role back in those days. Bob had a lot of success. He watched his brothers win quite a few races as well, but was able to be one of the original great pioneers of the sport back in the day. He was able to win some pretty big races, and I think he also won Daytona Beach, and I think he also won the first pole for NASCAR back in 1949. He won a lot of big races, I think he won the first race from the pole, if I remember correctly, and was able to do that in 1949 and 1950, and went on to watch his brothers have a lot of success not too far down the road, as Bob Flock was able to get a few pretty big wins in his NASCAR Cup Series career. In the number 86 position, I have Ross Chastain. Ross Chastain has currently scored 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, has 30 top 5s, 51 top 10s, and has done this so far in 209 starts. All of Ross Chastain's success has come in the last 3 years, and in 2022 and 2023, he was able to win a combined 4 races. While Ross has not won a race so far, I do think he will win before the end of this season. Ross Chastain is also known for being a watermelon farmer, and every time he wins a NASCAR Cup Series race, he goes out there and smashes watermelons. But another great thing he accomplished was the Hail Melon, where he basically ran on the outside wall of Martinsville and was able to get into the championship 4 and nearly won the championship in 2022. While he wasn't as successful in 2023, he still won a national in Phoenix in that same season. Ross Chastain's been a very solid driver for the sport, has a pretty big fan base, has a really great personality as well, and like I mentioned, has accomplished a lot in a very short period of time. He will be around for many years to come, as they'll say with track cars racing for the foreseeable future. He'll probably win around 10 to 15 races by the end of his NASCAR Cup Series career. But at this moment right now, he currently still only has 4 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series with Trackhouse Racing. In the number 85 position, we have Ralph Moody. Ralph Moody scored 5 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 18 top 5s, had 27 top 10s, and did this in 47 starts. Ralph Moody won a lot of races in the mid-1950s, but what he's most known for is being the co-owner of the Holman Moody organization, which is one of the first really successful organizations in the 1950s and in the 1960s as well. Ralph Moody won some pretty big races during those days. Obviously, there were a lot more races back then in the 50s and 60s, so you could win some lesser races too. But Ralph, I believe, almost got inducted. I think he might have been inducted or has been close to getting inducted, if I'm not mistaken, into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. If he's not inducted, he should be, because he innovated a lot of great things, helped with some safety things and safety precautions as well, and helped try to grow the sport in a big way after his driving duties. He was most, like I said, known for being an owner of the sport, but he did accomplish some stuff back in the day and was able to complete and do some pretty great things in the sport in his short stay as a driver. And then he did a lot of those and put some innovations as a owner during the time. In the number 84 position, I have Jeremy Mayfield. Jeremy Mayfield scored 5 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 48 top 5s, and 96 top 10s and did this in 433 starts. Jerry Mayfield raced from the mid to late 1990s up until 2009, where unfortunately NASCAR indefinitely suspended him, but I think they did go ahead and reinstate him back in 2012 or 2013, but it's still not been allowed to come back. Jeremy Mayfield was best well known for winning multiple pretty big races at Pocono in 1998 and in 2000 as well, but he also won an Auto Club in 2000. But during that same year in 2000, when he drove for Penske Racing South, it still wasn't the most successful years. Then he left Penske at the end of 2001 and joined Everham in 2002. And he had some success in 2004, 2005, making the playoffs in both of those respective years, getting a clutch win at Richmond and also winning a fuel mileage race in Michigan. And still, while he didn't get a ton of top 10s throughout that year, he was able to join a very, very cut and a very, very tough group that made the championship run that year. Jeremy had a lot of success. Then he tried ownership. It really didn't work out, and he hasn't been racing in NASCAR since, but he did do some pretty great things in a short stay with Penske and also Everham and also Cale Yarborough's team as well, and he got discovered by Cale Yarborough to get the chance and opportunity to drive in NASCAR not too far down the road. In the number 83 position, I have Tiny Lund. Tiny Lund scored 5 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment was winning the 1963 Daytona 500 after substituting in for Marvin Panch. He had 54 top 5s, 110 top 10s, and he did this in 303 starts. Tiny Lund did have a lot of success, and I think his first win, of course, did come in that 1963 Daytona 500, but also won a few races down the road. He drove for the Wood Brothers and had a lot of success in the 60s, and I think in the late 60s and early 70s as well. Tiny Lund obviously hasn't, but unfortunately he did pass away many years ago, sadly, but Tiny Lund did have a lot of success and was able to put up a lot of accomplishments in a very short period of time. Winning a lot of races or a few races in a very short period of time. It took him a long time to get that first win, but once you eventually get that first win, it does lead to a lot of success. He got the chance and opportunity, got the chance to run in the sport, and did some great things in the 1960s and 1970s. Won some big events and was able to accomplish quite a few big things in a very short period of time, driving for the Wood Brothers as well. In the number 82 position, we have Dave Marcus. Dave Marcus won 5 races in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 94 top 5s, 222 top 10s, and did this in 883 starts. Dave Marcus, a lot of success, came in the 1970s and 1980s, but the best thing that he was most well known for was being a driver that was able to win as an independent owner. And he was an independent owner and driver for pretty much his whole entire racing career. And he also has a pretty big record where he's able to make Daytona 500, I think 30 or 31 times in a row, and still holds that record to this day. And also, I still believe to this day has ran the most Daytona 500s, where he raced in a 500 from the 1960s or 1970s up until 2002 when he went and retired. Dave Marcus is still around in the sport in some sort of capacity. He's been spotted at multiple different events, just being around drivers and kind of coaching and kind of joking with drivers around in the industry. Dave Marcus did have a lot of success, won some pretty big events, won at Richmond in 1982, and also had some years where he competed for the championship as an independent driver. He was a very underrated driver back in the day. He was someone kind of like Ryan Newman who wouldn't get out of your way. You had to get by him at times, but he was still well-loved and respected by many in NASCAR. He had a ton of success, won some pretty big events, and was able to do a lot of stuff in the 70s and also in the 1980s as well, driving for his own organization. In the number 81 position, we have Chris Buescher. Chris Buescher scored 5 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series up to this point, has 24 top 5s, 64 top 10s, and has done this in 315 starts. Now, Chris Buescher's first win came back in 2016 in a fog-shortened race, in a rain-shortened race at Pocono Speedway in the 34 car for Front Row Motorsports. Now, he won the Xfinity Series Championship with Roush. Then he went to JHD Doherty Racing for a few years from 2017 to 2019, and then came back to Roush. But a lot of success did not start coming for Chris Buescher until just a few years ago when he won at Bristol in 2022. And last year in 2023, he was able to win the last 3 races that he has won. He won, of course, at Richmond, then he won in Michigan, and then he won at Daytona, winning 3 of 5 races in a row, or winning 3 of 5 races. Chris Buescher's had a lot of success and also has been close to winning a few races, nearly by Kyle Larson in the great photo finish at Kansas Kansas earlier this year, and also probably should have won Darlington during the throwback weekend. While the team has fallen off a little bit, Chris Buescher's success happening has been very impressive and incredible, and I do believe that Chris Buescher is going to continue being very successful many years down the road. I think he'll win a race for the end of this year and continue to move his name up the pipeline and continue to make big things happen. He currently sits 81st on the list. I do think in the future he will move up with the success that he had and all the accomplishments he had up to this point. He's going to accomplish more, and I think he will win more races with RFK as that team continues to improve as an organization in the NASCAR Cup Series. In the number 80 position, we have Dan Gurney. Dan Gurney scored 5 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He had 8 top 5s, 10 top 10s, and did this in only, get this, 16 starts. Half the race that Danny Gurney ran in the Cup Series, he finished in the top 5. And basically a third of the races that he competed in, he went on to win. Dan Gurney, I believe, competed for the Woodburrs for a majority of those races, which is the fastest organization. But Dan Gurney was a very solid driver in all forms of racing. He, of course, I think almost won the Indy 500. He also, of course, has won F1 race, and I think he nearly won an F1 championship. He's one of 3 drivers that has won an F1 race in a NASCAR Cup race as well, that being him, of course, Mario Andretti, who won the 1967 Daytona 500, and also Juan Pablo Montoya, who won 2 NASCAR Cup Series races, those coming in 2007 and 2010. I think Dan Gurney is one of the pioneers of racing altogether, had a ton of success, and was able to accomplish a lot of things in the few races that he ran in the sport. Was one of the early American pioneers and was able to win some pretty big races, including, I think, once or twice at Riverside Speedway, and that last one coming in 1963. He did have a lot of success in motorsports in the 50s and also the 1960s as well. In the number 79 position, we have Ward Burton. Ward Burton scored 5 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishments were winning the 2002 Daytona 500, the 2001 Southern 500, had 24 top 5s, 82 top 10s, and did this in 375 starts. Ward Burton, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated drivers in NASCAR Cup Series competition. His first one came at Rockingham, I believe, back in 1995 or 1996, and then he didn't win for a very, very long time with the number 22 organization, but his next win did not come till 2000 when he won the 5th race of the season at Darlington Raceway. And then, like I mentioned, he won a 2001 Southern 500. 2002 is where most of his success ended up happening. Like I mentioned, he won the 2002 Daytona 500 and also won at New Hampshire that same year. The reason, though, that the season did not end up going as well is because they were super inconsistent. I think he finished like 20th in the standings because that team was really inconsistent and they had a ton of crashes and wrecks where they probably should have won a few more races and also got into an infamous little feud with Dale Jr. during the 2002 night race at Bristol. Ward Burton, though, was someone who didn't really care at times, basically didn't care what he had to say, and it was definitely very funny to look at. He had a ton of success in a short period of time. Is still around looking for snakes at this point, but he did accomplish a lot, and Ward Burton currently sits number 79 on my list and might save this position in the years coming. In the number 78 position, we have Jim Reed. Jim Reed scored 7 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 38 top 5s and 47 top 10s, and did this in 106 starts. Jim Reed is one of the original pioneers in NASCAR. All of his wins came from a period of time from about 1950 to 1951 up until 1953 through 1956. He competed for his own team and organization and just knew how to wheel a race car. He's someone that I think is kind of forgotten in history because a lot of those pioneers in the sport are kind of forgotten through time. But having 7 wins in the early 1950s was still very impressive, even though the fields were not as competitive in the 1950s. He did some great things, though, in the early portions of history and was able to accomplish quite a bit in a very short period of time. Jim Reed will be remembered for some of the stuff he did in the early days of the sport and the early accomplishments he did. I think he won a Daytona Beach road course as well, and I think he nearly won some other big races, nearly won a Southern 500 a couple times. But Jim Reed, a lot of his major success came in the early days of sport, and he currently sits number 78 on my list. In the number 77 position, I have Alan Kulwicki. Alan Kulwicki scored 5 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment was winning the 1992 NASCAR Cup Series championship, had 38 top 5s and 75 top 10s, and did this in 207 starts. Many of you are probably going to question this one because of all the innovations that Alan Kulwicki had, and I kind of understand where people are coming from. He is a major reason why we have a lot of college athletes coming in, because a lot of the pit road people that Alan Kulwicki had were college athletes coming from sports like the NFL and also from the football athletics programs as well. I just couldn't put Alan Kulwicki a little higher because there's a lot of better drivers on the list going up. And I don't know if Alan Kulwicki would have won a lot more races, but winning that championship in 1992, which is considered to be one of the greatest seasons in NASCAR Cup Series history, you can't squab over that. He had a lot of success in the day, won some pretty big races, a lot of success. He, of course, won the first Phoenix race in 1988 and is known for the Kulwicki victory lap. He did some great things in the 1980s and 1990s and did it in a very short period of time after, unfortunately, his tragic plane crash in 1993. He could have won more races, and we know that Junior Johnson was trying to pick him up, but he did this all independently. Inspire Motorsports to this day, drivers like Corey LaJoie, Carson Osbar as well, were able to basically kind of imitate that and do that number and go to that shop for a short period of time. In the number 76 position, we have Tyler Reddick. Tyler Reddick has currently scored 6 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, has 35 top 5s, 72 top 10s, and has done this in 168 starts. Tyler Reddick is most well known for having 2 NASCAR Xfinity Series championships in 2018 and 2019, but in the last 2 years, he has become the most successful driver at this point in 2311 racing history. Tyler Reddick won at Talladega earlier this year. He won 3 races with Richard Schultz Racing in 2022, those coming at Road America. I think he also won a race later down the road at Texas Motor Speedway, and a majority of his wins have come at road courses, also won in 2023 at COTA, also won at Kansas, and like I mentioned, won at Talladega. And Tyler Reddick has a really great chance and opportunity to win his first championship this year. I think Tyler Reddick is very close to getting it done, and I think he will win a championship before his NASCAR Cup Series career is over. He's already had a lot of success in a very short period of time, and I do think his success is only going to continue getting better. He's been close to winning a few races, and I do think by the end of his NASCAR Cup Series career, he'll probably be in the top 40 or 50 on the list for sure, and probably higher than that, because I think 2311 Racing along Bubba Wallace being there, I think they're going to get better, but I do think that Tyler Reddick is a great talent and a great driver who will get higher on the list. In the number 75 position, we have Marshall Teague. Marshall Teague scored 7 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 9 top 5s, 11 top 10s, and did this in only 23 starts. Marshall Teague was known for 2 things. 1, driving the fabulous Hudson Hornet in the 1950s. But the other big thing that Marshall Teague was well known for was being the king of the beach at Daytona Beach Road Course. Most of his NASCAR Cup Series wins came at the Daytona Beach Road Course because he knew how to get around the racetrack. He had a lot of success at that racetrack for many, many years and went on to accomplish a lot in a very short period of time. He drove, like I said, the fabulous Hudson Hornet. I think he's had some pretty big innovations as well as he tried to grow the sport in a pretty big way. Marshall Teague did some pretty good things, and like I mentioned, was able to make it up in the top 75. I would consider him a top 75 great at this current moment, though he might fall out in the future. But I think Marshall Teague is still a very solid driver back in the day, and still, like I said, is considered the king of the beach, and also known for driving that, like I said, that fabulous and legendary Hudson Hornet. In the number 74 position, we have Darrell Dieringer. Darrell Dieringer won 7 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment was winning the 1966 Southern 500. He had 45 top 5s, 79 top 10s, and did this in 181 starts. Darrell Dieringer competed from the late 1950s up until the early 1970s and was most well known for driving for Junior Johnson, being one of the earliest drivers when Junior Johnson went from transitioning from a driver over to being a full-time owner. And he nearly won the 1965 Southern 500, but unfortunately had, I think, an engine failure or something broke on the car, handing that win to Ned Jarrett, who won that race in the largest margin in NASCAR Cup Series competition still to this day. Darrell Derringer was up front on a year-by-year basis and nearly won a couple championships in the early to mid-1960s. He won some pretty big races in his time, accomplished a lot of big stuff, and was able to make the list once again this year. He absolutely deserves to be on the list, accomplished a lot of great things, and was able to win 7 NASCAR Cup Series races, and currently sits number 74 on my list. In the number 73 position, we have Jamie McMurray. Jamie McMurray scored 7 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Daytona 500 and the Brickyard 400 both in the same year. In 2010, has 63 top 5s, 169 top 10s, and did this in 584 starts. While Jamie McMurray was not the most flashy driver out there by competing for championships on a year-by-year basis, Jamie McMurray was known for winning a lot of big races in his time. One of his early accomplishments was winning in his second start, substituting for Sterling Marlin, who sat out for the rest of the year after an injury at Kansas Speedway. Then he took a while to get his second win. He drove, of course, for Chip Ganassi, but that 2004 season is considered to be one of the greatest years for a driver that never made the playoffs and probably should have won a few races during 2004. Then in 2007, he picked up a second win in the Pepsi 400 and was known as a really great super speedway racer as well, as he won a couple massive and huge super speedway races in his NASCAR Cup Series career. He, of course, like I said, won both Daytona 500 and Brickyard 400 in the same year. And that 2010 year, he also won at Charlotte. And he also won at Talladega in 2013 and won the All-Star race in 2014 as well. Jay McMurray to this day is now a commentator on TV, which he's an amazing commentator, and he's done some great things for the sport behind the scenes. He's helped grow it, and I think that Jay McMurray is one of the most underrated drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history with what he was able to accomplish in this sport. In the number 72 position, we have A.J. Foyt. A.J. Foyt scored 7 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1972 Daytona 500, had 29 top 5s, 36 top 10s, and did this in 128 starts. All around in motorsports, when you talk about motorsports success in history, many people consider A.J. Foyt to probably be not just the greatest driver of his time, maybe the greatest race car driver in racing history, because he won, I think, at Le Mans. He also won the Indianapolis 500 4 times and came over to NASCAR and was able to accomplish a lot in a very short period of time. And winning the Daytona 500, especially in the early 1970s, was not a joke, and also got to drive for the famous Wood Brothers organization as well. And some of the biggest names in its sports history, that being Tony Stewart, also supported A.J. Foyt, and that was a big inspiration to Tony Stewart. He also, I believe, drove in the original Brickyard 400 as well and raced in that big event. AJ raced for a very, very long time, eventually giving up in the mid-1990s to focus on an ownership role and trying to grow his organization. AJ had a lot of success in the early days of the sport, and like I mentioned, won the Daytona 500 also in 1972. In the number 71 position, we have Kyle Petty. Kyle Petty scored 8 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment was winning the 1987 Coca-Cola 600, had 52 top 5s, 173 top 10s, and did this in 829 starts. What a lot of people forget about Kyle Petty, to say a lot of people consider Kyle Petty kind of a joke to some people, but people forget Kyle Petty in the 80s and 90s was a very, very solid driver. While he wasn't as good as his father Richard or his grandfather Lee Petty was, Kyle Petty still was a very solid driver. He won with the Wood Brothers, and one of his biggest accomplishments was he was so good at Rockingham in the early 1990s. I think 3 or 4 of his wins in his Cup Series career came at Rockingham Speedway. He's one of the most successful drivers in that racetrack's history because he knew how to save tires and save fuel as well. And he nearly won the championship in 1992. We all forget he was in that championship battle in the 1992 season. Kyle Petty is still to this day kind of commentating, though he hasn't really been on TV recently, but I think Kyle Petty could be part of broadcasting in the future. But he was still a very solid race car driver, competed until 2008. His career probably should not have lasted as long as it did, and had his career ended a lot earlier than it did. I think a lot of people looking at Kyle Petty in a more fonder light. Still, he had quite a bit of success and was able to make the top 75 on this year's list once again. In the number 70 position, we have Alex Bowman. Alex Bowman has scored 8 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, has 38 top 5s, 91 top 10s, and has done this in 311 starts. All of Alex Bowman's success has really come in the last 5 to 6 years since joining Hendrick Motorsports. One big accomplishment Alex Bowman's been able to do is he's been able to finish every position from first to 43rd position since racing in the NASCAR Cup Series. The biggest accomplishment for Alex Bowman, in my opinion, is winning at the Chicago Street Course earlier this year, though it was a little bit controversial how that kind of ended. Alex Bowman has had a lot of success, and you kind of look at him, and he's starting to once again become a championship contender and a threat once again for his first ever championship. In 2021, he won 4 races, and we all kind of thought this might be the new Alex Bowman that we are looking at. But I don't know if that is going to be the case long term. But I do think Alex Bowman is still going to win more races, and I think by the end of his NASCAR Cup Series career, he more than likely will end up having around 15 to 20 wins in his NASCAR Cup Series career. But at the meantime, he's won some big events and big races, and he's got a chance and opportunity to win his first championship in 2024 with Hendrick Motorsports. In the number 69 position, we have Bob Welborn. Bob Welborn scored 9 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 58 top 5s, had 102 top 10s, and did this in 183 starts. Bob Welborn was a pioneer of NASCAR, racing from the early to mid-1950s up until I think the early 1960s. And all of his success came in a very short period of time. I don't think Bob Welborn took up ownership roles, but he won some races at a lot of dirt in short tracks back in the day, which led to him being one of the early pioneers of the sport. And he's also considered to be one of the current top 75 greatest NASCAR Cup Series drivers of all time. And he also was more well known as well for winning championships in the convertible series. He is considered to many people to be the greatest convertible series driver, which is where a majority of his success ended up coming from. Well, Bob Welborn had a ton of success in his day and was able to win some pretty big races, and like I said, won convertible championships in 1953 and 1957 as well. In the number 68 position, we have Paul Goldsmith. Paul Goldsmith won 9 races in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 44 top 5s, 59 top 10s, and did this in 127 starts. Paul Goldsmith is most well known for winning the final race at the Daytona Beach Road Course in 1958 before they transitioned to going on the high banks at Daytona International Speedway. Paul Goldsmith won a majority of his races at tracks like the Daytona Beach Road Course and was a pioneer of the sport, and I think also helped the safety of the sport in the 1950s as well. He's known for helping grow the sport in certain ways, in certain capacities, and also is pretty popular. But one also kind of cool fact about Paul Goldsmith is he wasn't just successful in NASCAR Cup competition, but he's also a champion in motorcycle racing. He won some AAA championships across the world, so he's not only known for winning races in NASCAR, but also winning races on motorcycles as well, and had a ton and a lot of success. In the number 67 position, we have Cotton Owens. Cotton Owens scored 9 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 52 top 5s, 84 top 10s, and did this in 160 starts. Cotton Owens, like Paul Goldsmith, was also a pioneer of the sport, competing in the 1950s and the early 1960s as well. He's most well known for being an owner. Not only did he win races as a driver, but also won races as an owner as well. And he is also a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well, as he was inducted about 5 or 6 years ago into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, I think in the Pioneer ballot. Cotton Owens was able to accomplish a lot in the sport, winning some races with some pretty big name drivers. I think he was rumored at one point he was maybe the owner of the Hudson Hornet. We're not entirely sure. But Cotton Owens was able to accomplish a lot in a very short period of time as a race car driver, but then is able to accomplish also a lot as a car owner as well, and went on to win some pretty big races in his time, and currently sits number 67 on my list. In the number 66 position, we have Christopher Bell. Christopher Bell currently has 9 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment up to this point so far is winning the 2024 Coca-Cola 600, has 38 top 5s, 74 top 10s, and has done this in just 166 starts. Christopher Bell is one of the top drivers in NASCAR Cup Series competition. Since getting the Joe Gibbs Racing in 2021, this is where all of his success has come from. He won at Daytona Beach in 2021 on the Daytona Road Course, I'd say in 2021. Then in 2022, he won 3 races during that season in New Hampshire, the Roval, and Martinsville during that kind of crazy Hail Melon race. Then last year in 2023, scored a win or 2. And then this year so far, he has scored 3 victories. Christopher Bell is someone who I believe is a championship threat and will win a NASCAR Cup Series championship in the next 2 years. If he makes the Final Four this year, he most likely will be your NASCAR Cup Series champion because that 20 car was super fast and competitive at Phoenix earlier this year. The Joe Gibbs cars were super quick, though other teams have probably caught up. Still, by the end of his career, he'll probably have around 25 to 30 NASCAR Cup Series wins, and I think he will for sure be a NASCAR Hall of Famer and might also end up being a first ballot NASCAR Hall of Famer because all the success he's already had up to this point. In the number 65 position, we have Clint Bowyer. Clint Bowyer scored 10 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 82 top 5s, 226 top 10s, and did this in 541 starts. A lot of people now know him as a commentator for Fox Sports, but Clint Bowyer, during his time as a competitor, he was super competitive and was a championship contender. He won the Xfinity Series championship in 2008 and nearly won a couple Busch Series championships back in the day, but also, of course, nearly won the championship in 2012 with Michael Waltrip Racing. He was a big reason why Michael Waltrip Racing went from a team that was on their way up to being a championship contender, and also having Ryan Childress there definitely helped in a pretty big way. But Clint Bowyer left Michael Waltrip Racing at the end of 2015, went to H. Scott Motorsports, had that horrendous season, and then 2017 went to Stewart-Haas Racing. In 2018, went on to win 2 races and made the round of 8 and nearly made the championship for that season as well. Clint Bowyer was a very solid race car driver, accomplishing a lot in a very short period of time because Clint Bowyer only really competed for about 10 or 15 years. That's kind of a short career for NASCAR Cup drivers. Clint had a lot of success in a very short period of time, won with Toyota, and also won with Ford and Chevrolet as well, which to this day are still the 3 big name manufacturers in NASCAR Cup competition. Also won a couple races at Talladega as well. In the number 64 position, we have Sterling Marlin. Sterling Marlin scored 10 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 Daytona 500s, those going back-to-back in 1994 and 1995. He had 83 top 5s, 216 top 10s, and did this in 748 starts. Sterling Marlin had one of the longest tenured careers in NASCAR Cup competition. His first start came all the way back in 1976, driving the belief for his father, Coo Marlin, and really a lot of success in NASCAR didn't really come till the early 1990s when he drove for Morgan McClure. But in the early to late 1980s as well, he started having chances to compete and go and win races. He won multiple races in Morgan McClure and was a great super speedway racer, winning at Daytona twice, actually 3 times winning at Daytona, winning at Talladega once or twice back, I think in 1995 or 96. He won at Talladega, and also in 1999 or 2001, he also won at Michigan and Charlotte that year. He went to Chip Ganassi Racing and was able to compete for a championship in 2001, and also had a chance to win the championship in 2002 before unfortunately crashing out. I think Sterling Marlin is one of the biggest what-if drivers in the sport. He nearly won the championship, and had it not been for a scary crash that he had at Kansas, I truly do believe that Sterling Marlin would have absolutely been winning more races and might have been a Hall of Famer and could have been a champion as well. Still, he had a ton of success, won some big events and races, and was able to win some pretty big races, including 2 Daytona 500 victories as well. In the number 63 position, we have Donnie Allison. Donnie Allison scored 10 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, his biggest win coming in the 1970 Coca-Cola 600. He has 78 top 5s, 115 top 10s, and did this in 242 starts. It was also confirmed last year that Donnie Allison was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Donnie Allison was part of the legendary Alabama gang and also won at Talladega Superspeedway in the early days of that racetrack as well. All of Donnie Allison's success came in the 1970s. What he's most well known for is being part of the fight that took place between Cale Yarborough, his brother Bobby, and of course himself, which really gave NASCAR the opportunity and chance to really grow. And Donnie had a lot of success. He was also champion at his locals tracks back in the day, and he kind of joined the sport in a very late blooming era. Had he joined a little earlier, I think he could have had a more successful career. But still, Donnie Allison was a very solid race car driver, accomplished a lot, and was able to win 10 races, and now is officially inducted into the NASCAR Cup Series or NASCAR Hall of Fame. In the number 62 position, we have Dick Rathman. Dick Rathman scored 13 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 69 top 5s, nice, 79 top 10s, and did this in 129 starts. Dick Rathman was one of the pioneers of NASCAR, competing from the mid-1950s up until the end of the 1950s. All of his success in a very short period of time came in about a couple of years. And I think Dick Raffin is kind of one of the more forgotten drivers in the pioneer days of the sport. But like I mentioned, it said, he had a ton of success in that short period of time, winning some pretty big events at some of the short tracks. I think he nearly won at Martinsville as well, and almost also won at Darlington in his time. I think Dick Raffin is kind of one of the more forgotten drivers of the sport, but he accomplished so much in a very short period of time. 13 wins is nothing to slouch about. He had a ton of success, and I think he should be kind of remembered for the success he had in a small time. He currently sits number 62 on my list, respectively. In the number 61 position, we have Ryan Blaney. Ryan Blaney has 12 wins in NASCAR Cup Series competition. He won last year's championship in 2023. He also won the Coca-Cola 600 in 2023 as well. Has 76 top fives and has done this in 142 top tens and has done this currently in 328 starts. Ryan Blaney is one of the most popular drivers currently in NASCAR Cup Series competition, but is also one of the most successful drivers in NASCAR Cup Series competition to this day. While he still at this moment is, to a lot of people, one of the more undeserving champions, Ryan Blaney is still one of the best personalities for the sport. He's really wanted to grow the sport in a very big way, and I think that's another reason he's moved up on this list so much over the last year. Last year, I think I had him around 70 for 71st. He's moved up quite a bit because of that championship. I think Ryan Blaney overall is a very solid race car driver. He accomplished a lot in NASCAR Cup Series competition so far up to this point. And I think there's a great chance of possibility that by the end of this season, he could be a two-time champion, which I think would be basically the least amount of wins so far for a two-time champion up to this point. But I think there's a great chance and possibility that he'll be a champion once again this season. Ryan Blaney has accomplished a lot, done some pretty great things in the sport up to this point. Great personality, accomplished a lot in such a short time, and I do think Ryan Blaney will continue to be a very successful ambassador for the sport and will be looking to grow NASCAR into much bigger heights going into the near future. In the number 60 position, we have Dick Hutcherson. Dick Hutcherson scored 14 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 64 top fives, 73 top tens, and did this in only 103 starts. Dick Hutcherson competed in the early days of the sport, I believe in the 1950s, and also I think in the early 1960s as well. He competed in a very short period of time and really only had a couple really solid, successful years, but those years were extremely impressive and extremely compatible. He was one of the early pioneers of the sport, but also helped grow NASCAR in very solid ways. Dick accomplished a lot, winning a lot of big short track races, and I think it's pretty incredible to see what he was able to do as a driver in the NASCAR Cup Series. I think he won some convertible series races as well, won some pretty big events in a short period of time, racing in the NASCAR Cup competition. Retired way too soon. Had he stuck around for a lot longer, I think he definitely would have been able to win some more races in his time in the NASCAR Cup Series. In the number 59 position, I have Leroy Yarbrough. Leroy Yarbrough scored 14 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, and he did something really incredible in 1969. He won the Daytona 500, the Southern 500, and the Coca-Cola 600 all in the same year. He had 65 top fives, 92 top tens, and did this in 198 starts. He has no relationship to Cale Yarbrough, but Leroy Yarbrough was not only a driver who was successful in NASCAR, he also attempted to run the Indianapolis 500 as well, and was a very successful driver. Unfortunately, his career kind of took a really sad note when he suffered, I think, a basilar skull fracture in the late 1960s going into the early 1970s. And unfortunately, his story went very dark very, very quickly, and I'm not going to talk about that here. I want to focus on his racing and driving career. And his racing and driving career, like I mentioned and said, was extremely successful. He won some pretty big events. Winning 3 races in a single year is absolutely incredible. There's no ifs and buts about it. And accomplishing that up to this point is very, very incredible. He could have raced a lot longer, had a lot more success. I do think he's a great driver, was historically a great man, did some great things, and not a great man, but he did some great things and was able to accomplish a lot of big things in his time in the sport in like a very short period of time. As like I said, he only basically competed in 198 starts, which again, to have all that success is very, very impressive. In the number 58 position, we have Tim Richmond. Tim Richmond scored 13 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment was winning the 1986 Southern 500. He had 42 top 5s, 78 top 10s, and did this in 185 starts. Tim Richmond was really the first major celebrity, really the first major driver in success to come out of Hendrick Motorsports outside of Jeff Bodine. Tim Richmond won a lot of races in a short period of time. He won a lot of races in 1986 and also won a lot of races in 1987 as well, nearly winning the championship, finishing inside the top 5 of the title in 1986. Unfortunately, his career got cut short early, and I feel like had his career got not cut short early, I do truly believe that Tim Richmond would have won around 20 to 30 more races in his time and could have gone up against a driver like Dale Earnhardt for a championship. I think Tim Richmond unfortunately passed away due to AIDS complications in 1989, but Tim Richmond was well remembered by a lot of people. He also had a very decent career in IndyCar because he also ran the Indy 500, was the Rookie of the Year for the Indy 500 in the 1980s, and came over to NASCAR and was great friends with Dale Earnhardt as well. He was a great driver, a very solid race car driver, friend to many, and success to many as well. I don't know if he's in the NASCAR Hall of Fame yet, but I think he should be a consideration for the Hall of Fame because of all the stuff he did accomplish in a very short period of time, also helping build up Hendrick Motorsports. In the number 57 position, we have William Byron. William Byron currently has 13 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment is winning the 2024 Daytona 500 earlier this year. Has 48 top 5s, 95 top 10s, and has done this so far in 238 starts. When William Byron joined the Cup Series, there was a lot of hype around him. And for the first few years, that hype kind of died down. But all of a sudden, when he got Rudy Fugle as a crew chief in 2021, they just started to set sail. 2021, William Byron only won one race that year, but was extremely consistent. Then in 2022, he won 3 or 4 races that year, or twice, I should say, in 2022 or something like that. In 2023, he basically went up and just started winning. He won 6 races that season. And then in 2024 so far, he's won 3 races. Well, he's been on a little bit of a downward spiral recently in performance. I think William Byron is still one of the best drivers in the sport. And he's, I think, the youngest driver that could win a championship. He's been close to winning a championship so far this year. And he could have a chance to get his first title by the end of this year. He's been a very solid and a great competitor for the NASCAR Cup Series, has won some pretty big events, including Daytona, and I do think William Byron is going to only get better and stronger and will win around 40 to 50 races more than likely by the end of his NASCAR Cup Series career. In the number 56 position, we have Ernie Irvan. Ernie Irvan scored 15 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest win was winning the 1991 Daytona 500, has 68 top 5s, 124 top 10s, and did this in 313 starts. All of Ernie Irvan's success came with 2 organizations. He drove the 4-car for Morgan McClure. He was a major reason why Morgan McClure became the success he ended up being for many, many years. And also, of course, went on to win with Robert Yates Racing when he drove the 28-car and won a lot of big races. His story is kind of like one of those big what-if stories. In 1994, he actually had a really great chance and opportunity to beat Dale Earnhardt in the championship, but unfortunately suffered a very scary and a life-threatening crash at Michigan Speedway, and it wasn't known if he was ever going to come back. Then he got redemption when he came back in 1997 and won at Michigan. While a lot of success did not come after this for Ernie Irvan, who suffered a career-ending crash not too far after this, Ernie Irvan was still very successful. He was also a great road course racer and won races at Sonoma Raceway as well. And I think he's been inducted into the Sonoma Raceway Hall of Fame. He's a great driver and respected by many and had a lot of success. And Ernie Irvan is one of the greatest drivers in NASCAR Cup Series competition. In the number 55 position, we have Marvin Panch. Marvin Panch scored 17 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1961 Daytona 500, the 1966 Coca-Cola 600, had 96 top 5s, 126 top 10s, and did this in 216 starts. Marvin Panch is most well known for driving for the Wood Brothers and nearly also won the 1963 Daytona 500, but had to get out and Tiny Lund replace him right before the race even started. Marvin Panch is one of the greatest drivers of the early days of this sport. He won a lot of races in the 1960s and also won a lot of races in the mid-1960s as well. And he is considered to be one of the best drivers during the early days of the sport, in the 1960s and one of the first drivers who was extremely successful for the Wood brothers back in the day. He was one of the early pioneers, one of the early favorites to many, and one second to none with how great of an attitude he had in this sport. He was extremely successful, did a lot of fantastic and amazing things driving for the Wood brothers, and won a ton of major and great events in the NASCAR Cup Series, including a Daytona 500 as well. In the number 54 position, we have Curtis Turner. Curtis Turner won 17 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1956 Southern 500, had 54 top 5s, 73 top 10s, and did this in 184 starts. Curtis Turner's nickname is known as Pops, but a lot of his success came in the convertible series. He won multiple races and is considered by many to actually be the most successful driver in convertible series history. But Curtis Turner was really the first driver in NASCAR Cup Series competition to really be a celebrity. He was the first NASCAR driver to be on Sports Illustrated magazine, was also kind of a rebel as well. Curtis Turner never cared about running for a championship. All he cared about was winning races, which I think is a really great mentality to have. Even though you want to win a championship, he already won championships in the convertible series, so coming over to Cup, it kind of felt like nothing to him. He also was really one of the early constructors of Charlotte Motor Speedway, and I think he and the original owner, Bruton Smith, kind of got a little bit of a feud back in the day because of it. Curtis Turner was successful, accomplishable, accomplished a lot in his day, and was known for being kind of a rowdy person, was also known as one of the early true American badasses in NASCAR Cup competition, and was also known as one of the biggest partying drivers in NASCAR Cup competition in the history of the sport as well. In the number 53 position, we have Kasey Kahne. Kasey Kahne scored 18 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 2017 Brickyard 400, which is his final win in NASCAR Cup Series competition. Had 3 Coca-Cola 600 wins, had 93 top 5s, 176 top 10s, and did this in 529 starts. Kasey Kahne was to many people considered to be the next Jeff Gordon. He had a ton of success in the early days of the sport, and Ray Abraham was the one who truly and really ended up discovering him back in the day. And he went on to have a very great Rookie of the Year. He had one of the greatest rookie candidacies and nearly won 6 or 7 races during his rookie year. His first win came in 2005 at Richmond, but during that year, he had a little bit of an off year and fell off just a little bit. Then 2006, he flourished. He won 6 races, all of those pretty much coming all on mile-and-a-half tracks because Abraham's team found something in their program on the mile-and-a-half, and it led to a ton and a lot of success on the mile-and-a-half as well. Then he kind of fell off a little bit with the team, but in 2008 had a little bit of resurgence by winning at Charlotte, the Co 600, and also winning that later that season as well. Then he fell off a little bit, but he won with Red Bull Racing in 2011, and then of course in 2012 went over to Hendrick and had a chance to win the championship. Kasey Kahne is one of the more underrated drivers in NASCAR Cup competition. Could have had a lot more success, but he did accomplish a lot and won some pretty massive and major races in his NASCAR Cup Series career, including winning a Brickyard 400 and also winning 3 Coca-Cola 600 wins, and is considered to be a driver who could in the future may be a challenger to get into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. In the number 52 position, we have Ryan Newman. Ryan Newman scored 18 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 2008 Daytona 500, the 2013 Brickyard 400, had 117 top 5s, 268 top 10s, and did this in 733 starts. Ryan Newman is most well known not just for winning the Daytona 500 and also winning the Brickyard 400, but he was known as the Rocket Man. Many people consider him to be the greatest pole qualifier in NASCAR Cup competition because every time you had a race on a bigger oval or at a track, it really didn't matter. Ryan Newman somehow found a way, especially early in his career, to go out there and win a ton of poles. That's why he was called the Rocket Man. Ryan Newman also was very successful in the early days of his career. And really early in time, he was actually better than Jimmy Johnson, who went on to be one of the best drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. He won a lot of races in the early days, including having an 8-win season in 2003. The reason he didn't go on and win the championship was because he crashed out in 7 races, and I think at 6 or 7 DNFs. It was a frustrating year for him, which is why they kind of got the playoff system that we have currently at the moment. So if you want to blame a driver, kind of blame Ryan Newman for that. Still, Ryan Newman was a great driver in his day and in his prime, and he accomplished a lot in his NASCAR Cup Series career. as a NASCAR Cup Series driver with teams like Penske and Superhaas Racing as well, and RCR nearly win the championship in 2014. In the number 51 position, we have Geoff Bodine. Geoff Bodine scored 18 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. His biggest accomplishment was winning the 1986 Daytona 500, had 100 top 5s, 190 top 10s, and did this in 575 starts. Geoff Bodine, while he's most well known for winning the Daytona 500 nearly 40 years ago, his biggest thing that he ended up doing was really getting Hendrick Motorsports a chance and opportunity to be in the sport. During that week at Martinsville where they went on to win the race, they were talking about closing Hendrick Motorsports, which at the time they were called All-Star Racing. And Rick Hendrick said if they did not go on and win that race at Martinsville, he was going to shut and close the doors. Had that not happened, we may have not had Hendrick Motorsports, and we may never have had the most successful organization in NASCAR Cup Series and NASCAR history altogether. And we may never had drivers like Jeff Gordon, Kyle Larson, those guys be as successful as they are today. But they ended up being extremely successful and winning some pretty big races. And Jeff was great at Hendrick Motorsports and went on to own his own team and had a lot of success owning his own organization as well. He put on some great runs, did a very solid job in his day, and did a really great job in the 80s and the 1990s as well, which is where he got all of his wins. In the number 50 position, we have handsome Harry Gant. Harry Gant scored 18 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Southern 500 twice, had 123 top 5s, 208 top 10s, and did this in 474 starts. Harry Gant is a late bloomer. His first win did not come to when I believe he was 40 or 41 years old back in 1981 or 1982. But a lot of his success came in the late 80s to the early 90s, including in 1992, where at the age of 50 or 51 years old, became the oldest NASCAR Cup Series driver to win a NASCAR race at Michigan, and still won a few races later that season as well. Harry Gant is a driver that I would absolutely consider to be a NASCAR Hall of Famer, because he did win some great races in his day and his time, and he accomplished a lot of big things in the time he raced in this sport. He's not forgotten. He can accomplish a lot, had a ton of success, won some fantastic races, and did a great job in the sport in the early days as well. He's a great talent. He's a legend in my opinion. Did a lot of fantastic and won some major events, and I consider Harry Gant to be one of the most legendary drivers in the 1990s, and I absolutely would consider for sure that he is a first ballot, or not a first ballot, but he should absolutely be in the NASCAR Hall of Fame in the not-so-distant future. In the number 49 position, we have Neil Bonnet. Neil Bonnet scored 18 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1981 Southern 500, won the Coca-Cola 600 twice, had 83 top 5s, 156 top 10s, and did this in 362 starts. Neil Bonnet, in my opinion, was one of the more underrated drivers in NASCAR history as well. He was known for being a CBS commentator in the 80s and the 90s as well, was also a very successful driver. Unfortunately, he passed away, I think, in a practice crash or a testing crash in 1994 for the Daytona 500 as he was looking to get back into competition in 1994, driving for Ridge Schultz Racing, as he was basically best friends with Dale Sr. back in the day. And Neil Bonnet was a legend of this sport. He did a lot of great things and won some major events. I think he was the driver who went on to win that race in Australia in the 1980s when they raced there on Christmas. And Neil Bonnet, in general, put up a lot of great things and won some major events in his time. And his success carried from the early days from the late 1970s, which is where he got his first win in the late 1970s, and his last wins coming in the late 1980s and going into the early 90s as well. He retired a little early, then he came back, and Neil Bonnet still accomplished a lot. Won a lot of massive and major races in his time, and went on to do a lot of fantastic things, and was able to accomplish a lot in his NASCAR Cup Series career, and went on to win some major events, and was very popular with the fan base as well. In the number 48 position, we have Fonnie Flock. Fonnie Flock scored 19 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, his biggest win coming in the 1952 Southern 500, has 72 top 5s, 83 top 10s, and did this in 154 starts. He was one of the most early successful pioneers in NASCAR Cup Series history, as he also nearly won multiple championships in the early 1950s. All of his success came in that early day of the sport, because I think he retired around 1956, to 1957 after he accomplished pretty much all he wanted to accomplish, which there's nothing wrong with that. He is the second most successful flock brother, and I think he went into ownership and went into a different role to try to help grow the sport in a way, which to this day, I think whatever he ended up doing really did in fact end up helping. And I think he is one of the more successful drivers in the history of the sport as well for what he did in the early days of NASCAR. He was extremely successful, did a lot of fantastic and accomplished a lot, and he was great for the early days of NASCAR Cup Series competition as a whole. So he won a ton of big events, won a ton of big races in the early days, and of course, like I mentioned, won the 1952 Southern 500. In the number 47 position, we have Greg Biffle. Greg Biffle scored 19 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Southern 500 twice, those coming in 2005 and 2006. Had 92 top 5s, 175 top 10s, and did this in 515 starts. Greg Biffle had a very late blooming career. Well, we have to realize his rookie year was when he was 34 years old. He was a late bloomer. He won the Xfinity Series Championship in 2002 and also won the Truck Championship in 2000 when he was in his 30s. His rookie season wasn't until 2003. Had Greg Biffle been a lot younger and joined Roush in an earlier time, I do think he would have been a lot more successful and had a lot more wins. To win 19 races in a span of about 13 to 14 years is honestly super amazing and super incredible when you think about it. And he still has been racing recently. He's been racing in some big events, and he raced in a Trans Am race very recently. And he won races and was very loyal to Roush. He almost won a championship in 2005 and nearly became the first driver in NASCAR history to win a championship in the trucks, the Xfinity Series, and the Cup history. And to do that all, I think is super amazing and super incredible and super impressive. Greg Biffle is one of the legends of the sport. I would consider him a Hall of Famer, and I do think in the future he will get inducted in the Hall of Fame if NASCAR does change the rules, kind of just a little bit. Will they do that? I don't know at this point, but I do think Greg Biffle in the future should be for sure a NASCAR Hall of Famer in NASCAR history, because I do truly think Greg Biffle is a NASCAR Hall of Famer in my opinion. In the number 46 position, we have Speedy Thompson. Speedy Thompson scored 20 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1957 Southern 500, has 77 top 5s, 105 top 10s, and did this in 197 starts. Speedy Thompson competed in a very short period of time, I believe from the mid-1950s up until the end of the 1950s. All of his success came in about a 2 to 3 year span from what I remember, but in that short time, he nearly won some championships. And he accomplished a lot too, and was one of the early pioneers of the sport. He nearly won some other big events. I think he nearly won the Daytona 500 at the end of his career, and was in contention to win some of the other mass events in his time. And to see Speedy Thompson get 20 wins is super impressive. Especially back then, yes, there was a lot more races you can win, but you have 20 wins, and that is still pretty good in your career. And I consider him to be one of the better drivers in NASCAR Cup competition at this point. He was a solid driver, a very successful driver nonetheless as well, and I consider Speedy Thompson to be one of the better drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history, as he currently sits number 46 on my list. In the number 45 position, we have Jack Smith. Jack Smith scored 21 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 95 top 5s, 142 top 10s, and did this in 264 starts. Very similar to Speedy Thompson, Jack Smith competed in the early days of NASCAR Cup Series competition. He started basically, I think, in like 1950 or 1951 and raced up until the early to mid-1960s. And a lot of his success came from the mid-1950s up until the early to mid-1960s. He also, I think, originally won the first race at Bristol, but I think he gave up that win at Bristol and gave it to Johnny Allen, and also was a driver who won some pretty big events on dirt, and also was a legend of early days of competition. He nearly raced in other forms as well, and I consider Jack Smith to be one of the early pioneers who went on to have a lot of success. I still think he stuck around the sport after he retired from NASCAR Cup Series competition, but I certainly consider him a great, and he currently sits number 45 on my list. In the number 44 position, we have Buddy Baker. Buddy Baker scored 19 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1980 Daytona 500, the 1970 Southern 500. He won the Coca-Cola 600 3 times, had 202 top 5s, 311 top 10s, and did it in 700 starts. Buddy Baker's career spanned from the late 1950s up until the early 1990s, but his career was extremely remarkable. He is known for being the son of Buck Baker, who's one of the most successful drivers in history, and you've got another driver who also, I believe, became a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well, as Buddy Baker not only had a successful career on the racetrack, but he's also known for having a great career off the racetrack as a commentator. He worked for CBS Sports for many years and was a great commentator working with CBS with people like Mike Joy and Ned Jarrett. Buddy Baker also drove the legendary Grey Goose, which is considered to be one of the greatest cars in history. Many drivers still to this day do drive that Grey Goose as a sponsor, and we've also seen a lot of other big drivers trying to respect Ricky Rudd as a great. He was also a spotter time at one point for Ryan Newman back in the day as well, trying to guide and help him. Buddy Baker's a legend, had a racing school, I think, as well, to try to help a lot of young drivers grow. He did that. He helped many grow as a great super speed racer and also had a ton and a lot of major success. And I have Buddy Baker currently in 44th position on my list. Also was a driver that basically had a lot of true grit and had a lot of determination as well as a NASCAR Cup Series driver. In the number 43 position, we have Jeff Burton. Jeff Burton scored 21 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1999 Southern 500. He won the Coca-Cola 600 twice, those being in 1999 and 2001. He had 134 top 5s, 254 top 10s, and did this in 695 starts. Jeff Burton, in my opinion, is a borderline NASCAR Hall of Famer and one of the most underrated drivers in his time. There were years where Jeff Burton was a champion. In the 1990s, he had a lot of success. Basically from 1996 basically from that 1996 year when he joined Roush up until the end of 1999 and really 2001 as well, he was a championship threat and contender. Then he fell off a little bit during the end of the Roush era, but then he went to Richard Childress Racing. He had a chance to make the playoffs in 2005, and then he went on to make the playoffs in 06, and people forget this. He had a chance to win the championship in 2006. Then in 2007 and 2008, he went on to win races before, unfortunately, not winning another NASCAR Cup Series race, though he technically did go on to win a duel. Jeff Burton is still working in the sport in this day, as working with a lot of the teams and the drivers when it comes to negotiations, and also is a part owner of the Cars Late Model Tour as well, and is also still a commentator. He's had a lot of success on and off the racetrack. He's also helped his son and tried to grow his son Harrison Burton, and I consider him to be one of the best drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. He had a lot of success. He absolutely deserves to be on this list for all he accomplished, and I consider him to be one of the best drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history, as he sits 43rd on my list. In the number 42 position, we have Davey Allison. Davey Allison scored 19 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1992 Daytona 500. He won the 1991 Coca-Cola 600, had 66 top 5s, 92 top 10s, and did this in 191 starts. Davey Allison had a very short career that was cut short early in 1993 after a helicopter crash. But Davey Allison, when he raced, was one of the best drivers that raced in the NASCAR Cup Series. He drove for Robert Yates Racing and really built that program up. And had it not been for that crash at Atlanta Motor Speedway, he probably goes on and wins the championship that season. He was super competitive that year, won a lot of races in his time, and was very accomplished, won multiple super speedway races, and he already, I believe, also won a race in 1993 as well. Had Davey Allison got to race a lot longer, I do think he could have been one of the most successful drivers. He could have gone up against drivers like Jeff Gordon and became one of the most successful drivers. Davey Allison, of course, got inducted in NASCAR Hall of Fame about 5 or 6 years ago, which is justified and, in my opinion, a great decision on NASCAR's end to induct him after all he accomplished. He was one of the best parts of the Alabama gang. He accomplished a lot of great things in the sport, built Robert Yates Racing up, nearly won the championship in 1992, had the fastest car majority of that season, and Davey Allison is 1,000% for sure one of the greatest NASCAR Cup Series drivers of all time, and currently sits in a really great position. I think he's one of the best drivers ever raced in this sport. In the number 41 position, we have Chase Elliott. Chase Elliott currently has 19 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Cup Series championship in 2020, has 100 top fives, 163 top tens, and has done this in 308 starts. Chase Elliott has been one of the best young drivers coming through the ranks over the last decade or so. It took him a few years to get his first win, but his first win came in 2018 at Watkins Glen, and ever since then, the floodgates have opened. He won 3 races in 2018, those coming at Watkins Glen, Dover, and basically Kansas. Then in 2019, he got 3 or 4 victories, but unfortunately had a massive playoff collapse. And then in 2020, he went on to win 5 races and win the championship. Then in 2021, he went on to only win 2 races, but made the Final Four. 2022 had a 5-win season, had a shot to win the championship that year. 2023 was an off year, and so far this year, he got 1 win at Texas and is only 1 win away from picking up his 20th career win. I think Chase Elliott is going to have one of the most successful careers by the end of the time, and I think he'll have multiple championships in his NASCAR Cup Series career. He's been extremely successful, has won a lot of races up to this point, and keep in mind, Chase Elliott doesn't turn 29 for a few more months. So Chase Elliott's got at least 10 to 15 years, and if he averages, let's say, 3 to 4 wins a year going forward, he can end up with nearly 60 wins in his career. I think he's still going to win a ton of races, and I do think Chase Elliott will be remembered as one of the best NASCAR Cup Series drivers in the history of this sport. In the number 40 position, we have Benny Parsons. Benny Parsons won 21 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the NASCAR Cup Series Championship in 1973, won the 1975 Daytona 500, won the 1980 Coca-Cola 600, had 199 top fives, had 283 top tens, and did this in 526 starts. Benny Parsons is one of the most successful drivers in the 1970s and the early 1980s as well. He wasn't just known for being a great race car driver, he was also known for being a great broadcaster as well. Many people to this day even still consider him to be the greatest broadcaster, color commentator in the history of the sport. But Benny was a successful driver and has been a big advocate, was a massive advocate for safety. He was a legend of the sport. He's also a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well, and Benny Parsons is a legend of NASCAR Cup Series competition. The championship he won is definitely a little questionable with how they kind of formatted that championship, but regardless, Benny Parsons had a lot of success, was a driver advocate, did a fantastic job helping to grow the sport and help it grow in major ways, and Benny Parsons is one of the legends of the sport, and he currently sits at number 40 on my list because of all the success he had in NASCAR Cup Series competition. In the number 39 position, we have Bobby Labonte. Bobby Labonte won 21 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 2000 NASCAR Cup Series Championship. He won both the 2000 Brickyard 400 and the Southern 500 in the same year, and also won the 1995 Coca-Cola 600. He had 115 top fives, 203 top tens, and did this in 729 starts. Bobby Labonte's career is very interesting. He started very high. In 1995, his first win came in the Coca-Cola 600 and went on to win a lot of races at Atlanta Motor Speedway. And right after he won his championship, however, his career kind of started to decline just a little bit. He had a decent year in 2001, I believe, still finished in the top 10 in the standings, but fell off a little bit and began to fall off a little bit before having his final great year in 2003. And after 2004, his career kind of came off. And I think if there's one thing I argue about Bobby Labonte's career, is I think his career might have went a little too long. Because I think had Bobby Labonte retired a little sooner than he did, I think he would have had a lot more success in his time. Bobby's still one of the best drivers in the history of NASCAR Cup Series competition, but I wouldn't consider him to be a top 20 or 30 for sure. I think Bobby still is a very solid driver and is definitely a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well. In the number 38 position, we have Bobby Labonte's brother, Terry Labonte. Terry Labonte scored 22 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships, still coming in 1984 and 1996. He won 2 Southern 500s, his first win in 1980 and his last win in 2003. He had 182 top 5s, 361 top 10s, and did this in 190 starts. Terry Labonte had one of the most illustrious and long NASCAR Cup Series careers. He had a lot of successful years, really from the get-go, had success with teams like, I think, Dygaard, also drove the 44 car, and also was successful driving for Junior Johnson as well in the 80s and 90s, and then went to Hendrick Motorsports, and that's where his career really shined near the end of it. Terry Labonte is one of the most successful drivers of his day in the 1980s and 1990s, but many people also had a lot of respect for Terry Labonte. He was one of the most respectful drivers on the racetrack, and generally kind of raced with a lot of respect and raced very fairly and also very cleanly. Had some rivals, of course, with drivers like Dale Sr. during the end of his career, but he was able to be a legend of the sport and was also a Hall of Famer. We also got to see Kyle Larson honor him earlier this year. I think Terry Labonte is one of the best drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. He's one of the great legends of the sport, and 1,000% for sure, I think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. He deserves to be on this list for how legendary of a driver he is, and he 1,000% is a great talent, and he currently sits 38th on my list. In the number 37 position, we have Ricky Rudd. Ricky Rudd scored 23 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Brickyard 400 in 1997, had 194 top 5s, 374 top 10s, and did this in 906 starts. Ricky Rudd had one of the longest illustrious NASCAR Cup Series careers in the history of the sport. And one big thing about Ricky Rudd is while he didn't go out there and win like 3 or 4 races in a single year, he only usually had 1 win in a year. But he had a streak of like 18 years where he went on to win a race. I think from like 1983 or 1984 up until 2000 is when he won a race. Or 1998, I think, 1997, excuse me, is the last time he won in that time. Ricky Rudd was just really good. He won a lot of great races. He won races at Dover for Hendrick Motorsports. He won for his own team and organization when his team was really good. And Ricky Rudd now just got inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, which I think he's earned that honor to get into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, just because of everything he's done in the last few years, really for the last time. He did come back in 2007. It wasn't a great season, but he is still, to me, one of the best drivers and one of the most respectful drivers, and had some rivals, one in the 26 for Kenny Bernstein and all those people, but Ricky Rudd is still one of the better drivers in history and currently sits number 37 on my list. In the number 36 position, we have Jim Buechele. Jim Buechele won 25 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 Coca-Cola 600 races, had 149 top 5s, and 230 top 10s, and did this in 421 starts. Jim Buechele is kind of considered the line for whether you do deserve to be in the NASCAR Hall of Fame or not. And I make a little bit of an argument for Jim Buechele being in the NASCAR Hall of Fame because he did win 25 races. I get he didn't win a lot of major races, even though he did win 2 Coca-Cola 600s. A lot of his wins came in a lot of racetracks that kind of didn't require a lot of those big moments in time. But Jim Buechele still won a lot of massive races in the 50s and the 60s as well. And he was around for many years and nearly won a couple championships in the early to mid 1960s as well. Jim Buechele is kind of part of that line. I would love to see maybe in the future he gets considered. I don't think he will ever get in the Hall of Fame, unfortunately, but I think there should definitely be, at least at some point in the future, maybe some consideration for him to get in the Hall of Fame. But like I said, I don't know if Jim Buechele will ever end up in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. In the number 35 position, we have Joe Weatherly. Joe Weatherly scored 25 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships, I think back-to-back in 1963 and maybe 1964 as well. He had 105 top 5s, 153 top 10s, and did this in 230 starts. Joe Weatherly's career was extremely short, but it was extremely successful. Unfortunately, he passed away in a racing crash, I believe in 1965 or 1966. But in the time he raced, he was extremely successful. I believe he either raced for his own organization or drove for Junior Johnson. If he drove for Junior Johnson, there's a great chance that you were going to go out there and win a lot of races. He nearly won some other big races as well, nearly won the Daytona 500 a couple of times, and also nearly won, I think, a Coca-Cola 600 once or twice in his career. Joe's also a NASCAR Hall of Famer at this time, and I do think that Joe Weatherly will go on to be one of the greatest drivers and was one of the pioneers of the sport too, because he raced from basically the late 1950s to the 1960s. So he was a pioneer of the sport in the early days, and I think he's absolutely earned a spot on this list, and he is in the top 35 on this year's list. In the number 34 position, we have Fred Lorenzen. Fred Lorenzen scored 26 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1965 Daytona 500, has 75 top 5s, had 84 top 10s, and did this in just 158 starts. To have that kind of ratio where you nearly win a fifth of your starts is extremely impressive. A lot of Fred Lorenzen's success in NASCAR competition came from winning in Holman Moody equipment. Holman Moody Racing was the best organization out there. And Fred never really competed for a championship back in the day. I think he only had 1 or 2 years where he competed, and he finished in the top 5, I think in 1963 or 1964 in the standings. But what he did was he won a lot of races. He was extremely successful, won some big events, also had a lot of success, I think, in USAC, which led to him having more success in his day and his time. I think Fred Lorenzen is one of the better drivers from the 1960s era. He kind of was like the before Richard Petty in a sense, where he was able to have a ton of success and was able to win a lot of major events. I think he's one of the best drivers in history, and I certainly consider him to be a great driver in the history of NASCAR Cup Series competition. In the number 33 position, we have Dale Earnhardt Jr. Dale Jr. scored 26 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He scored 2 Daytona 500 wins, those being in 2004 and 2014. He had 149 top 5s, 260 top 10s, and did this in 631 starts. Dale Jr.'s career is very, very interesting. The first half of Dale Jr.'s career, he was extremely successful. In 2000, won 2 or 3 races. Then in 2001, won 3 or 4 races. Then 2002 got a win or 2. In 2003, won a few races and had a chance to win the championship. Then in 2004, he went on to have his best NASCAR Cup Series career. But then really after that, it kind of started fading. He got a win in 05 and 06, and then he went to Hendrick Motorsports. The first year with Hendrick, he was extremely successful, did have a win, but he started fading at the end of that year, and it kind of led to the second half where 2009 and 2010 was a mess, before having a career resurgence from 2011 to 2015. And then he faded at the end there. Junior's career is very interesting, but he's not just well known for being a great driver on the racetrack, but was a great ambassador off the racetrack. Still to this day, he is the most well-known face in NASCAR. If you ask people about NASCAR, they're going to say Dale Sr. or Dale Jr. Dale Jr. not only was a great driver in the sport, he's a NASCAR famer because all the accomplishments he was able to do in this sport. He's one of the better drivers in the history. It was great in his day, won a couple of Xfinity Series championships as well, and Dale Jr. was very successful on the racetrack, and I think he won the most popular driver award more than any other driver, including Bill Elliott. He was one of the most popular drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. In the number 32 position, we have Rex White. Rex White scored 28 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1960 NASCAR Cup Series Championship, had 110 top 5s, 163 top 10s, and did this in 233 starts. Rex White competed from the mid to late 1950s up until the early 1960s, and during that time, he won a lot of races. He was very successful from the beginning of the time he raced in the sport and continued to get better as a driver, and that led to a lot of success. He was a pioneer of the sport, kind of almost got out of that pioneer era because once you get to the 60s and 70s, you kind of move toward the modern era a little bit and kind of the peak era of the sport. But Rex White was a champion, a very young champion at that. He might have been, outside of Bill Rexford, he might have been the youngest champion at that time, being only 31 years old when he won that championship. Rex was a great driver, nearly won some massive races. He was really great on short tracks and won a lot of great races and big events during his NASCAR Cup Series career, and by the way, is also a NASCAR Hall of Famer. In the number 31 position, we have cousin Carl Edwards. Carl Edwards scored 28 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Southern 500 and the Cocoa 600 both in the same year, that being in 2015. Had 124 top 5s, 220 top 10s, and did this in 445 starts. We also know that Carl Edwards will be going into the NASCAR Hall of Fame for next season, or next year. Carl Edwards is kind of one of those what-if stories, because Carl Edwards left the sport at the end of 2016, where I feel like that he probably could have stayed around for a few more seasons, because Carl Edwards was basically the best at this time. He almost won multiple championships in 2005, 2008, 2011, and 2016, but unfortunately came up way too short to get it done. I think had Carl ever stayed for a few more years, I think he would have won a championship and won a lot more races. And he left the sport in a very different position. Now, Carl could come back as a broadcaster in the near future, but I do think that Carl Edwards is still one of the best drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. He's one of the greatest Xfinity drivers, top 10 probably in Xfinity Series history, top 5. But I think Carl Edwards for sure is one of the greatest NASCAR Cup Series drivers in the history of NASCAR Cup Series competition and is a Hall of Famer as well. In the number 30 position, we have Kyle Larson. Kyle Larson currently has 27 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 2021 NASCAR Cup Series Championship. He just won the 2024 Brickyard 400. He won the 2023 Southern 500 and the 2021 Coca-Cola 600. He has 113 top 5s, 175 top 10s, and has done this in 352 starts. Kyle Larson is considered to be the best driver, not just in the United States currently at the moment, but in the world. And I can understand that. Since joining Hendrick Motorsports, because he had a lot of success at Chip Ganassi Racing. He won once in 2016, 4 times in 2017, and nearly won the championship with Ganassi. And then he won that last race in 2019. But since joining Hendrick in 2021, he has been one of the best drivers ever. He had a 10-win season. The last time a driver had 10 wins in a year was Jimmy Johnson back in 2007. He hasn't also had that dominant year since Jeff Gordon in 98. Kyle Larson also every year is a championship threat and contender, and by the end of his career, he could be a top 10 great. But I think he'll have a lot more wins, and Kyle Larson is one of the best ever, and he currently is sitting in a great position as he's entered the top 30 for the first time, and within the next 2 years, I think he will be in the top 20, and eventually probably in the top 15, and maybe in the top 10 as well. In the number 29 position, we have Dale Jarrett. Dale Jarrett scored 32 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the NASCAR Cup Series Championship in 1999. He had 3 Daytona 500 wins, those coming in 1993, 1996, and 2000. He won the Brickyard 400 twice in 1996 and 1999, and he also won the 1996 Coca-Cola 600. He had 163 top 5s, 260 top 10s, and did this in 668 starts. Dale Jarrett was one of the greatest drivers of the 1990s, and is kind of forgotten with all the success because he was up against some of the best drivers during the era. He was one of the best drivers for sure, but he's up against drivers like Mark Martin, Jeff Gordon, and Rusty Wallace, who are considered to be some of the greatest of the 1990s, and Dale Jarrett is no exception to that. He won a lot of major races, and a lot of that success even continued into the 2000s, where he contended for a championship in 2001 and was winning races up until 2005 when Yates kind of started collapsing at that point. And eventually Dale Jarrett went to Michael Waltrip Racing and then became a commentator on TV. Dale Jarrett was one of the most successful drivers, like I said, in NASCAR Cup Series history. He is a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well. Working with NBC nowadays, he's done a lot of fantastic things for the sport and currently sits right now in the number 29 position on my list. He's done a lot of great things for the sport. In the number 28 position, we have Fireball Roberts. Fireball Roberts scored 33 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1962 Daytona 500. He had 2 Southern 500 wins, had 93 top 5s, 122 top 10s, and did this in just 206 starts. Fireball Roberts is another driver that's probably one of the biggest what-if drivers. Fireball Roberts was considered at one point to be the greatest driver in NASCAR Cup competition. He raced in his Ford from 1950 up until 1964, and sadly during the Coca-Cola 600 that year, he unfortunately suffered very serious burns and sadly passed away from complications from those burns. But Fireball Roberts is also very innovative because he's a big reason why we have the fire suit that drivers are required to wear every single week. So we thank Fireball for that. Fireball was a legend of the sport, was a legend of the time, drove for the Hellman Moody organization, I think Junior Johnson maybe as well. And Fireball Roberts is one of the legends of the sport in the 1950s and the 1960s and has a massive impact on NASCAR Cup Series history with all he was able to accomplish for the sport in his given time. In the number 27 position, we have Joey Logano. Joey Logano has 33 wins currently in the NASCAR Cup Series. He has won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships, those coming in 2018 and 2022. He won the 2015 Daytona 500. He has 164 top 5s, 281 top 10s, and has done this in 565 starts. Joey Logano has been considered one of the greatest drivers in NASCAR Cup competition. And while the last couple years for Joey Logano have not gone as well, though he did win in Nashville, ending a long winless streak back to Atlanta in 2023, Joey Logano, in the time when he joined Team Penske, he was one of the most successful drivers. 2013 finished 8th in the standings and won the race at Michigan, and won at the young age of 18 years old, being the youngest driver to win a NASCAR Cup Series race. Then, of course, in 2014, 19 years old, I should say. Then in 2014 and 15, just went on to be championship contender. But I don't really think he's ever really recovered since. So 2016 was great, and he did win those championships. But Logano was so dominant in the mid-2010s that we kind of just forget about that because of all the stuff that has happened in the sport. I think Joey Logano is one of the best ever, and I think he'll still win a lot of races, and while his performance has fallen off just a little bit over the years, I still think Joey Logano is for sure one of the greatest NASCAR Cup Series drivers in the history of NASCAR Cup Series competition. In the number 26 position, we have Martin Truex Jr. Martin Truex Jr. currently has 34 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Cup Series championship in 2017. He won the Southern 500 in 2016 and is a two-time Coca-Cola 600 winner. He has 146 top 5s, 289 top 10s, and did this in 679 starts. Martin Truex Jr.'s career is extremely interesting. The first half of the career, it was a complete disaster for Martin Truex Jr. He only won from 2006 to 2014 or 15. He only won 3 races. Since 2016, when he got Cole Pearn as a crew chief in 2015, this team has really flourished. And he became one of the best drivers in NASCAR. But not only raced with a lot of respect, but he raced super clean. And he never really acts to grind. He did have some beef with drivers like Tony Stewart at points, but Martin Truex Jr. is one of the most respectful drivers, and many drivers want to race like Martin Truex Jr. And he's been one of the greatest drivers for NASCAR to that point. He will retire from full-time competition at the end of this season, but he will be racing part-time next year. In my opinion, he is 1,000% without a shadow of a doubt a first-ballot Hall of Famer, and I think he will go into Hall of Fame in the next couple of years and be one of the greatest drivers to ever get into NASCAR Cup Series Hall of Fame. In the number 25 position, we have Kurt Busch. Kurt Busch won 34 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Cup Series championship in 2004, won the 2017 Daytona 500, won the 2010 Coca-Cola 600, had 161 top 5s, 331 top 10s, and did this in 776 starts. Kurt Busch, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. But you wouldn't have thought that at the beginning of his career. From 2002 to 2005, Kurt Busch was on top of the world. He won a lot of races in 2002, won a lot of races in 2003, including winning a ton of races at Bristol, won the championship in 2004 and 2005, still won 3 or 4 races even though he lost his rival Roush at the end of the season. Since then, he's won races with Penske. He almost won races in that number 51 car. He won with Stewart-Haas Racing. He won with Chip Ganassi Racing. And he also went on to win with 2311 Racing. He still works at 2311 Racing to this day, and we still miss him being out on the racetrack. I think Kurt Busch is a first-ballot Hall of Famer without question, with everything he accomplished and all the success he brought to the table and everything he has done for the sport. As he's a big reason why things have happened, I think Kurt Busch went from a driver who was hated by many to being a favorite amongst many in the sport. I think he is a top 25 driver, and I think he will be a top 25 driver, at least for the long term and the foreseeable future. In the number 24 position, we have Brad Keselowski. Brad Keselowski has won 36 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Cup Series championship in 2012, won the 2018 Brigger 400 and the Southern 500 both in the same year in 2018, and also won the 2020 Coca-Cola 600, meaning he just needs a Daytona 500. He has 153 top 5s, 259 top 10s, and has done this in 543 starts. Brad Keselowski, a lot of his success came driving for Team Penske. He was a junior development driver back in the day in the early years from 2007 to 2009 and originally was going to be a Hendrick driver, but then got the opportunity to go to Team Penske, where a lot of his success really ended up coming from. 2010 wasn't great, but 2011 was a year he really flourished in the Cup Series. And since then, it's been nonstop. But then he left at 2021 to go to RFK Racing and become an owner, and it started off slow, but then it became really great. And Brad Keselowski has helped RFK become one of the best teams in NASCAR Cup Series history or competition at this point. And I think Brad will go on to really help the team continue to grow. And he just got his first win in 3 years earlier at Darlington. And I think Brad will win more races for the end of his career. While he's getting short to the end of it, I think Brad Keselowski for sure is one of the most successful drivers and one of the most successful owners up to this point in NASCAR Cup Series history. In the number 23 position, we have Bobby Isaac. Bobby Isaac won 37 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1970 NASCAR Cup Series Championship, had 134 top 5s, he had 170 top 10s, and did this in 308 starts. Bobby Isaac was known as someone who did everything his own way. He never was part of a union. It was one of the few drivers who never joined a union in NASCAR and was also extremely independent, which led to a lot of success. He won 37 races, which is also one of the winningest drivers in Cup competition as well. And some of those years, he beat drivers like Bobby Allison, Richard Petty, Cale Yarborough, you name it. Some of the best drivers during the era. David Pearson, he beat some of the greatest and won a championship in 1970. And I consider him to be one of the best ever to get behind the wheel of the race car. And I think what he did in a timing race is extremely impressive. Win over 10% of the races you enter is also very impressive for a driver. So I think he's one of the best ever to get behind the wheel, and I have him currently 23rd, and he's definitely one of the greatest drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history with everything that he was able to accomplish. In the number 22 position, we have Tim Flock. Tim Flock won 39 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships. He's one of the first drivers to have multiple championships in Cup competition. Had 102 top 5s, 129 top 10s, and did this in just 187 starts. Tim Flock was one of the early drivers who was a legend of the sport. But he's also legendary for another reason. Tim Flock had a pet monkey named Jocko Flocko. Jocko Flocko might have also helped him win a few races during that time as well. But Tim Flock, outside of that, was one of the most successful drivers in the early days. He was part of that legendary Flock family who won a lot of races. And Tim Flock is also a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well. I consider Tim Flock to be one of the best to ever get behind the wheel, especially in the early days of the sport, and had a lot of success. I know there was a lot of non-competition at that point, but you had to bring your own vehicle, and you had to be good at what you did. And that's why Tim Flock, for sure, is definitely 1,000% one of the best NASCAR Cup Series drivers in the history of the NASCAR Cup Series. In the number 21 position, we have Matt Kenseth. Matt Kenseth won 39 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the championship in 2003 for the Cup Series, despite only winning 1 race that year. He has 2 Daytona 500 wins, those coming in 2009 and 2012. He won the 2013 Southern 500 and also won the 2000 Coca-Cola 600, which was his first win in NASCAR Cup Series competition. He had 182 top 5s, a ton, and 331 top 10s, I believe, and a ton of starts, I think around 600, 700 starts in his NASCAR Cup Series career. Matt Kenseth is one of the most underrated drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history, but also one of the most mild-mannered drivers. He's not a driver that generally you would want to basically get pissed off, especially near the end of his career, but he was generally one of the drivers that raced you clean and very, very respectfully. And many drivers did go ahead and respected that. He was extremely successful behind the wheel, and he was helped Roush grow as an organization as well, part of that legendary 5-car Roush team that made the playoffs all that year, and was really one of the first dominoes that kind of caused Roush to really fall near the end when he left the organization to go to Joe Gibbs Racing, where he had a lot more success. In 2013, he won 7 or 6 races that season. And then in 2014, didn't win, but 2015 won 4 or 5 races and probably should have made the Final Four that season with how good he was in the second half of the year. Matt Kenseth was one of the legends and was still super competitive until he basically retired from full-time racing and then kind of came back in 2020, and we all kind of know how disastrous that was for him driving for Chip Ganassi. It wasn't great for him, but I still consider Matt Kenseth to be one of the greatest, and he's also a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well. In the number 20 position, we have Mark Martin. Mark Martin scored 40 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, won 2 Southern 500s, those coming in 1993 and 2009. He also won a 2002 Coca-Cola 600, had 271 top 5s, 453 top 10s, and did this in 882 starts. Mark Martin is considered to arguably be the best driver to never win a championship. And Mark Martin might have been the best in other series with how good he was, including having a season in 1998 where he won 7 races. The problem is, Jeff Gordon in 1998 had 13 wins. Both Jeff Gordon and Mark Martin were competing for that championship that year, and that was incredible. But Mark Martin was still competing for wins into his 50th year. He won races in 2009. And let's not forget, in 2012, driving for Michael Waltrip Racing, he nearly won a couple races that year, including at Pocono, when Joey Logano gave him a bump and run. Mark Martin also is probably the cleanest driver on the racetrack, and many drivers try to imitate that to this day. I consider Mark Martin arguably the best driver to never win a championship, though I think there's a couple of drivers on here that would probably argue their case. But I think Mark Martin is one of the greatest drivers ever, and he also really propelled Roush to be a fantastic organization, and that's why Mark's one of the greatest, and he's also a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well. He's one of the best ever to get behind the wheel, and he is definitely in the top 20 greatest at this point. He is one of the best drivers to race in NASCAR Cup Series competition. In the number 19 position, we have Bill Elliott, also known as Awesome Bill, from Dawsonville. Bill Elliott scored 44 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, won the 1988 NASCAR Cup Series Championship, won the Daytona 500 2 times, and won the 2002 Brickyard 400, and also won the Southern 500 3 times. He had 175 top 5s, 320 top 10s, and did this in 828 starts. Bill Elliott in the 1980s up until the early 2000s was one of the greatest drivers in his era. He was extremely great with that number 9 car, which was extremely successful, the Harry Melling organization, which with the Coors Light sponsorship, which led Bill Elliott to a lot of his success. And then he went over to drive for Junior Johnson for a few years and went on to win a lot of races. Then, of course, he went over to drive for his own organization, and that kind of fell off a little bit until he left the team to go to Everham, and he had a career resurgence from 2001 to 2003. He won at Homestead in 2001, then 2002, won the Brickyard 400, and also won at Pocono. And then in 2003, he did go on to win at Rockingham, which was his final win. He is one of the best to ever race, was Mr. Most Popular Driver, which is why a lot of Chase Elliott fans really kind of climbed in him because, of course, they rooted for his father, Bill. He is considered to be one of the best ever and raced with a lot of respect and was one of the more aggressive drivers at times as well. But Bill Elliott is a legend. He was very mild-mannered, and he's not a driver that kind of said a lot of things to the media. So Bill Elliott is for sure one of the best ever to get behind the wheel of a NASCAR Cup Series car, as he sits number 19. In the number 18 position, we have Buck Baker. Buck Baker scored 46 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships, won 3 Southern 500s, had 246 top 5s, 372 top 10s, and did this in 635 starts. Buck Baker is one of the early pioneers of NASCAR Cup Series history, and he had a lot of success in the early days of the sport. He was one of the first multi-champions in the history, but those are coming, I think, in 1956, potentially in 1957 as well. And he just was super successful in the late 1950s, but also had a ton of success in the early 1960s as well. And he just was great in his day. He won some major races in his time, and he did, like I said, winning 3 Southern 500s. At the time, winning Southern 500 was even bigger than a Daytona 500. So winning that big of a race, you were a legend, and you're considered to be one of the best if you don't just win one, but if you win multiple of Southern 500s, you are considered to be one of the best drivers in the history of the sport. He's one of the greatest ever, one of the legends of the sport, one of the best in the making, and he currently sits number 18 on my list. He's also a NASCAR Hall of Famer as well, which I think is absolutely justified and is absolutely deserved for him, in my honest opinion. He's absolutely one of the greatest drivers to ever race in NASCAR Cup Series competition. In the number 17 position, we have Herb Thomas. Herb Thomas scored 48 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships, I think in 1952 and 1953. He won the Southern 500 3 times, had 122 top 5s, had 156 top 10s, and did this in only 229 starts. He basically ran a very short career, but he nearly won a quarter of the starts he entered, which is super impressive for a driver race for a very short period of time. He is one of the best to ever race, and had Herb Thomas race a lot longer than he did, I do think that Herb Thomas could have absolutely been able to win a lot more races and be even higher on this list. But Herb Thomas is a legend of NASCAR. He's a Hall of Famer with everything he was able to accomplish, and to nearly win 50 races in your career is absolutely amazing and just incredible and really, really impressive for a driver. So I think Herb Thomas is definitely one of the better drivers for sure, and he currently sits inside the top 17 on my list and will be number 17 on this year's list for the 2024 edition. In the number 16 position, we have Tony Stewart. Tony Stewart scored 49 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 3 NASCAR Cup Series championships, those coming in 2002, 2005, and 2011. He has 2 Brickyard 400 wins, those coming in 2005 and 2007. Had 187 top 5s, 308 top 10s, and did this in 618 starts. Tony Stewart had a very, very interesting career, but one of the greatest careers in the sport. And Tony Stewart, to this day, if you consider some of the best, like talent-wise, Tony Stewart is one of the greatest talents to race in the sport. He is the only driver that's won an IndyCar championship and a NASCAR Cup Series championship, which to do that is extremely incredible. But not only that, Tony Stewart had that incredible year in 2011 where he went on to win 5 of the final 10 races of the year. And I think that Tony Stewart also really helped build Stewart-Haas Racing up. He was one of the fastest drivers in that season, and let's be real and frank, he should have absolutely had a chance and opportunity to win that championship that season, and he probably should have been up there competing with Jimmy and those guys. But Tony Stewart went on to win that 2011 championship where he won 5 races, which is extremely impressive, and Tony Stewart's one of the best to ever do it. And I think he's a Hall of Famer, not just for what he did as an owner. He's an owner champion with Kevin Harvick being there. I think that Tony Stewart's one of the best ever race in NASCAR Cup Series history, and he currently sits inside the top 16, and he's one of the best drivers to race, especially in competing against many of the greatest drivers ever in Cup Series history. In the number 15 position, we have Junior Johnson. Junior Johnson won 50 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the 1960 Daytona 500, had 121 top 5s, 148 top 10s, and did this in 313 starts. Now, Junior Johnson was not only a successful race car driver, not winning a championship, but of course winning a ton of races, but is also arguably one of the most successful owners in NASCAR Cup Series history. Junior Johnson won a lot of championships as an owner, winning 7 or 8 championships during his time, but also he won a lot of races. And you think about Junior Johnson, he was really one of the early pioneers. He is a massive reason why NASCAR is still around and why NASCAR really became what it is now. And he's one of the most respected names in NASCAR history. He became a legend of the sport, became a legend for everybody, and is one of the greatest ever get behind the wheel of a race car. And I think he is one of the greatest ever driving NASCAR Cup Series competition. He had true grit. He was an American badass, and basically was one of the people that really helped get the bootlegging started to really get NASCAR to where it is today. He's a first ballot Hall of Famer, which he absolutely should be, and he's one of the best to ever not win a championship. You could argue probably is, but he's definitely one of the best for sure to never win a NASCAR Cup Series title. In the number 14 position, we have Ned Jarrett. Ned Jarrett won 50 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships in 1961 and 1965. He won the 1965 Southern 500 in the largest margin in NASCAR Cup Series history by I think either 13 or 15 laps, had 185 top 5s, 239 top 10s, and did this in 352 starts. Ned Jarrett, to a lot of people, is considered to be the greatest driver in NASCAR. Had Ned Jarrett continued to race longer in the sport, I do think that Ned Jarrett could have actually been the king instead of Richard Petty. Ned Jarrett retired at a very young age because he accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think had Ned Jarrett stuck around a lot longer, I think he would have been more successful and probably would have won another 50 or 60 races. Because back in the 60s and 70s, you had a lot more races on the Cup Series schedule, which is why I think Ned Jarrett is one of the best to ever race, and is also one of the greatest broadcasters to race as well, and he was broadcasting just up until a few years ago in certain capacities. I think Ned Jarrett's one of the best to ever race. He's a legend of NASCAR Cup Series competition, and is one of the best ever. He drove, I think, for Holman Moody and a couple of organizations as well. He is definitely for sure one of the greatest drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. In the number 13 position, we have Denny Hamlin. Denny Hamlin has won 54 races as a NASCAR Cup Series driver, has won the Daytona 500 3 times, those coming in 2016, 2019, and 2020. He has 3 Southern 500 victories. He won the Coca-Cola 600 in 2022, has 230 top 5s, 349 top 10s, and has done this in 672 starts. Denny Hamlin is, in my opinion, the greatest driver at this point to never win a championship. But Denny Hamlin has come super, super close to winning a championship. And not only that, he came very close to winning a Breaker over 100 earlier this year. And while many of you probably don't appreciate Denny Hamlin as maybe the personality he is, you cannot deny that Denny Hamlin is one of the greatest drivers to ever strap behind the wheel of a NASCAR Cup Series car. He's been the most successful driver, JHR, in recent years, and I think he is absolutely, for sure, 1,000% one of the best to ever do it. I think he's I think he's a legend, and I think Denny Hamlin 1,000% is one of the best to ever do it. And I think he will win around 60. His goal, if he doesn't win a championship, is to win around 60 races, which I think Denny Hamlin can do because he only needs 6 more wins, and he only needs a few more to get it done. I think Denny has a great chance because he's going to be around at least another year or two, but Denny is 1,000% for sure a first ballot Hall of Famer and one of the best to ever do it, and he's leading a team like 23XI trying to help Tyler Reddick and Bubba Wallace to get them a championship, and maybe in the future, a guy like Riley Herbst as well. But Denny Hamlin's done a lot of great things for the sport. In the number 12 position, we have Lee Petty. Lee Petty won 54 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won 3 NASCAR Cup Series championships, I believe becoming the first 3-time champion in NASCAR Cup competition. He won the first Daytona 500 in 1959, had 331 top 5s, 332 top 10s, and did this in 427 starts. Lee Petty is basically considered at the time, the beginning of the time, maybe the greatest driver in the early days of the sport. Because Lee Petty was an absolute beast and a legend. He won a lot of races, a lot of those races, and really was a big reason why the Petty name became as big as it was. And had it not been for Lee being around, we probably don't have Richard Petty around in the sport. And Lee was an absolute legend in the 50s. He won many races, competed for championships. Hell, he probably should have won the championship in 1950 and got into, I think, a fist fight with Bill France. This is why he lost the championship and lost all the points that he had, which will cost him a shot at the championship that year in that season. He's one of the best for sure. He could have been a 4-time champion, and we probably would never have been talking about Bill Rexford ever being a champion. But I digress. Lee Petty's one of the best ever, and he currently sits number 12 on my all-time list with the number 12 position. In the number 11 position, we have Rusty Wallace. Rusty Wallace won 55 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Cup Series championship in 1989, won the Coca-Cola 600 in 1990, had 202 top 5s, 349 top 10s, and did this in 706 starts. While Rusty Wallace never won anything major outside of the Coca-Cola 600, he had a chance to win a few of those races, including the 1999 Daytona 500, and he could have won the Breaker 400 in 2002. But Rusty Wallace was one of the greatest short track racers in NASCAR Cup competition. He won at Bristol Motor Speedway, I think like 9 or 10 times, if I remember correctly, and many consider him the king of Bristol Motor Speedway. But he also won a lot of races at Richmond. He was basically the king of Richmond for many years, and is also, to some people, considered the king of a track like Martinsville, because he won a lot of races. That's where he got his last win at. But Rusty Wallace was someone who never really worked with a lot of people, but his championship came with the 2017, and then most of his success came driving the number 2 car for Team Penske, to where, like I mentioned, he had a lot of massive and major success in his career. I think Rusty Wallace 1,000% is one of the best ever to get behind the wheel. He's still to this day working in the sport in some sort of capacity, I think, with MRN, and he's still a great broadcaster even too. He's gotten better at that side of things, and he's just one of the best to ever do this. He's one of the best to ever race in the sport, one of the greatest ever, one of the greatest short track racers, and someone that would not take anything from anybody. It was not able to hold back. He is absolutely 1,000% one of the greatest drivers to ever race in NASCAR Cup Series history. In the number 10 position, we have Kevin Harvick. Kevin Harvick won 60 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the Cup Series championship in 2014. He won the 2007 Daytona 500. He won the Breaker 400 3 times in 2003, 2019, and 2020. He won the Southern 500 twice, that being in 2000, I can't remember the years, I think it's 2014 if I remember correctly, and 2020. And he has 2 Coca-Cola 600 victories, those coming in 2011 and 2013. He had 251 top 5s, 444 top 10s, and did this in 826 starts. Now, Kevin Harvick did have a lot of success at Richard Childress Racing. That's where the early success happened. 2001, as a rookie, he won 2 races, and he basically took what originally was that 3 car and made it into his own thing for the 29 car. But then a lot of success came at Stewart-Haas Racing, which is where most of the success ended up happening. him working with Rodney Childers, he became one of the most successful drivers on a racetrack. And I think he is one of the greatest ever raced. And had he left RCR a little sooner than he did, because we know Tony was trying to get him back in 2009 or 2010, I do believe that Kevin Harvick absolutely, without question, could have had a lot more success. Now to this day, he's a broadcaster, which I think is a pretty solid broadcaster in my opinion, but he's absolutely 1,000% one of the greatest to ever get behind the wheel of a race car, and he's now to this day trying to help a lot of other people out. He's one of the best to ever do it, and Kevin Harvick 1,000% is one of the 10 greatest NASCAR Cup Series drivers and will be a first ballot Hall of Famer more than likely next year when he does in fact end up becoming eligible. In the number 9 position, we have Kyle Busch. Kyle Busch has 63 wins currently in the NASCAR Cup Series. He's a 2-time NASCAR Cup Series champion, those coming in 2015 and 2019. He has won the Brit Gore 400 2 times in 2015 and 2016. He won the Southern 500 in 2008 and also won the Coca-Cola 600 in 2018, meaning he only needs to win a Daytona 500 to complete the Crown Jewel legacy. He has 248 top 5s, 378 top 10s, and did this in 700 starts. Kyle Busch is considered by many to be the best driver of the modern era, and he is the winningest driver in all 3 series combined, as he has over 100 wins in the NASCAR Xfinity Series and has over 60, almost 70 wins in the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series as well. But Kyle Busch's success in the Cup Series alone is extremely impressive. And majority of that success has come with Joe Gibbs Racing. Now, at the beginning of his time with Hendrick Motorsports, he won 2 races as a rookie, then once in 2006, and then in 2007 he got 1 win before transition to Joe Gibbs Racing, where he got 8 wins. From 2008 to 2022, he won a lot of races with Joe Gibbs Racing. But he's kind of fallen off a little bit during that time. But in 2023, joining Rich Strauss Racing after issues with sponsorship, among other things, and M&M's leaving, he left to go and drive for Joe Gibbs Racing, where he went to have quite a bit of success first year, and then 2024 hasn't been as great. But Kyle Busch is one of the most successful drivers in NASCAR Cup Series competition, one of the best to ever race in the sport, and will 1,000% when he does retire from NASCAR Cup Series competition, he will be a first ballot Hall of Famer. He's one of the best to ever race, and he currently sits number 9 on my list. In the number 8 position, we have Cale Yarborough. Cale Yarborough won 83 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He was a 3-time NASCAR Cup Series champion, winning 3 championships in a row from 1976 through 1978. He has 4 Daytona 500 wins, 5 Southern 500 wins, had 255 top 5s, 319 top 10s, and did this in 560 starts. Cale Yarborough was extremely dominant in the 1960s, the late 60s, and the 70s, and also the 80s as well. And a lot of that success came driving for Junior Johnson. That's where most success came through. That's where all of his championships came, driving for Junior Johnson. But he was a legend of the sport. And Cale Yarborough also was part of that move, what happened in 1979, for the Daytona 500. He is one of the legends of NASCAR Cup Series competition, who was an ambassador for many, many years. He sadly passed away at the end of last year, which is really, really unfortunate. He's one of the greatest to ever race in the sport, one of the legends, one of the icons, one of the main people that really helped grow the sport. He was a rival to many drivers like Bobby Allison and Donnie Allison and Richard Petty, among others, and he raced against some of the greatest racers ever, and Cale Yarborough is one of the best to ever race, and he currently sits inside the top 8 on my list as one of the best to ever race in this sport. In the number 7 position, we have Bobby Allison. Bobby Allison scored 84 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. He won the NASCAR Cup Series championship in 1983 at the age of, I believe, 49 or 50 years old, becoming the oldest NASCAR Cup Series champion. Won 3 Daytona 500s, had 4 Southern 500 wins, had 3 Coca-Cola 600 wins, had 336 top 5s, 446 top 10s, and did this in 718 starts. Bobby Allison had one of the longest tenured racing careers. He started racing in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, where a lot of the early success came in, and continued to have a lot of success in the 1970s, and he had a ton of success also in the 1980s as well, and was one of the most successful drivers until 1988, where he won his final race in the Daytona 500 during that season. Bobby Allison was one of the greatest to ever race in this sport. He was also the main reason why the Alabama game became as successful as they were. And he's a legend of NASCAR. He's got the Bobby Allison School, which has helped a lot of drivers come through the ranks and has helped many of the greatest drivers that have ever raced in this sport. He was a massive legend to me, to many other fans across the board, and many drivers in NASCAR to this day looked up to drivers like Bobby Allison. He's one of the best to ever race, and he's one of the greatest ever, was a first ballot Hall of Famer, which is justified, and he made it this year as the number 7 driver on this year's list. In the number 6 position, we have Darrell Waltrip. Darrell Waltrip won 84 races in the NASCAR Cup Series, was a 3-time NASCAR Cup Series champion in 1981, I believe 1982, and also 1985 as well. He won the 1989 Daytona 500, saving enough gas driving for Hendrick Motorsports, won the 1992 Southern 500, which I believe might have been his final win. He has 5 Coca-Cola 600 wins, had 276 top 5s, 390 top 10s, and did this in 809 starts. Darrell Waltrip, also known as Jaws, not only known for being a fantastic race car driver, but also known for being one of the greatest commentators in NASCAR Cup history as well when he worked for Fox Sports. Darrell Waltrip was an absolute legend driving the car. He was one of the greatest ever short track racers, was a legend at Bristol Motor Speedway. He had a year where a streak of winning like 7 or 8 straight races at Bristol Motor Speedway from like 1980 up until 1984. He won races under the lights, won a lot of legendary races. His last one, of course, coming in 1992 or 1983 during the Southern 500, driving for his own team and organization, had success with Junior Johnson's team, and also had a ton of success with Hendrick Motorsports as well. And Darrell Waltrip, after he retired from racing, became a legend in the broadcasting booth. He's one of the best to ever race in NASCAR Cup Series history and will be remembered as one of the greatest legends ever, as one of the best to ever race. He's one of the GOATs and one of the best to ever race in NASCAR Cup Series history. He was really one of the defining moments for the 1980s. In the number 5 position, we have Jeff Gordon. Jeff Gordon won 93 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. He has 4 NASCAR Cup Series championships, 1995, 1997, 1998, and 2001. Had 3 Daytona 500 wins in 1997, 1999, in 2001. Had 5 Brickyard 400 wins, 1994, 1998, 2001, 2004, 2014. 6 Southern 500 wins, 3 Coco 600 wins, including his first ever win. 325 top 5s, 477 top 10s, and did this in 805 starts. Jeff Gordon is one of the greatest NASCAR drivers ever, and if you're looking at natural talent, he might be the best natural talent on this list. Jeff Gordon was a legend of the 1990s. In a stretch from 1995 to 1999, he won 40 races. That's almost better than what Richard Petty did, including that 13-win season where he went on to win, I think, the Coke 600 that year, and the Brickyard 400, and the Southern 500 in that year, and nearly won the Daytona 500 as well. Jeff Gordon is one of the best ever. He got basically a big reason why a lot of younger drivers now come through the ranks, and he is a massive reason why the sport really grew. When you talk about drivers who really helped grow the sport and impact the sport for many years, Jeff Gordon was absolutely that guy. He was a massive legend, an icon of the 1990s, and was still great up until the end of his career, where he still had chances to win championships. 2004, one of the best that year. 2007, arguably the best guy all year. In 2014, where he also probably should have won the championship. He's one of the best ever raced, the best of the 1990s in my opinion, and one of the greatest drivers. He currently sits in the top 5, and he's one of the best drivers in NASCAR Cup Series history. In the number 4 position, we have David Pearson, also known as the Silver Fox. David Pearson scored 105 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, had 3 NASCAR Cup Series championships. He won the 1976 Daytona 500. He had 3 Southern 500 wins, had 3 Coca-Cola 600 wins, had 301 top 5s, 366 top 10s, and did this in 574 starts. David Pearson to Richard Petty, who we talk about here just a little bit, he is considered to him the greatest driver. And you think about this, David Pearson, outside of a few years, never ran full-time. But in the years that David Pearson competed full-time in the NASCAR Cup Series, those 3 years, guess what? he went on to win the championship those years. And had David Pearson been able to run every year, he absolutely would have been in the best ever. And I think he could have won as many races as Richard Petty did, because if you compare him and Richard Petty together, both of them were super, super good racing, but David Pearson actually edged Richard Petty out racing against each other. They were friendly rivals, and they had a legendary battles for many years. And I think that David Pearson absolutely was a driver with respect. He was aggressive 1,000% for sure, but he was one of the best to ever get behind the wheel. He drove for the Wood Brothers and built up other organizations, and also helped Hallman Moody really grow as an organization as well. He's one of the most successful drivers in the history of the sport, and was a legend for many, many years, as David Pearson will be remembered as one of the greatest NASCAR drivers of all time, and he currently sits in the top 5 in number 4 on my list. In the number 3 position, we have the king, Richard Petty. Richard Petty scored 200 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, the most of any driver in Cup Series competition. Had 7 NASCAR Cup Series championships, 7 Daytona 500 wins. He won the 1967 Southern 500 and has 2 Coca-Cola 600 wins. Here's some other staggering stats. He had 555 top 5s, 712 top 10s, and did this in 1,184 starts. So you look at those stats and you probably ask yourself, why is Richard Petty not number 1? If it was based off of stats, I'd absolutely put him number 1. But unlike the top 2, Richard Petty had less competition. Not saying the competition that Richard Petty had was awful, but the competition that Richard Petty had in the Cup Series wasn't as good as what Dale Earnhardt or Jimmy Johnson had, because Richard Petty raced also at a lot of local dirt tracks as well. But you cannot deny having 700 top 10s is super, super impressive and absolutely amazing. There will be no driver in NASCAR Cup Series history, unless NASCAR completely expands the schedule and starts adding more races. There is no way any other driver will be able to accomplish that or getting any of these stats that Richard Petty has been able to accomplish. And I don't know if we're ever going to see a 7-time champion again in the sport. But if how good Kyle Larson is, you never know. That being said, I think Richard Petty is 1,000% for sure one of the greatest ever. But I would not consider him the greatest, but he's definitely in the top 3. You've got to have him in your top 3 because he is a 7-time champion. But I think of the competition side of things is why I have him number 3 on this year's list for the 2024 edition. In the second and runner-up position, I have Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy Johnson has 83 wins in NASCAR Cup Series competition, is a 7-time Cup champion, including winning 5 in a row from 2006 through 2010, has 2 Daytona 500 wins, 4 Brickyard 400 victories, 2 Southern 500 wins, and 4 Coca-Cola 600 wins. Jimmy Johnson scored 232 top 5s, 374 top 10s, and has so far done this in 694 starts. Now, last year, I had Jimmy Johnson number 1 on the list. But because of the performances dropping in the last few years and him kind of struggling this year coming back and running more races recently, I had to drop him from number 1. But I've got him number 2 because Jimmy Johnson competed against many legends. Tony Stewart, Denny Hamlin, Carl Edwards, Kurt Busch, Kyle Busch, Kyle Larson, Chase Elliott, you name it. Every legend of the sport, Bill Elliott, let's not forget him. Many drivers on this list compete against Jimmy Johnson. In a lot of those years, Jimmy Johnson beat them. Jimmy is an absolute legend and an icon of the sport, and he really built up the brand. And whether you don't love Jimmy Johnson or don't like Jimmy Johnson, you just at least do have to appreciate everything that Jimmy Johnson has absolutely been able to accomplish as a driver in the sport. He's an absolute legend. He's amazing. He brought the 48 legendariness and is arguably the most successful driver. Hendrick, though Jeff Gordon, I still think is a little more legendary, but I think that Jimmy Johnson is one of the best ever, and he currently sits at number 2 on my list. Which means that for the 2024 edition, the number 1 driver is Dale Earnhardt Sr., also known as the Intimidator. Dale Sr. scored 76 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series, won 7 NASCAR Cup Series championships, won the 1998 Daytona 500, won the Brickyard 400 in 1995, had 3 Southern 500 wins, had 3 Coca-Cola 600 wins, had 281 top 5s, 428 top 10s, and did this in 676 starts. Last year, I had Dale Sr. at number 2. I have decided to move him up to number 1 this year. Dale Sr. really brought the sport into a national light. He is a massive reason why the sport absolutely grew. And I don't think that RCR car that he drove was the best car even in the field. and he still absolutely willed that car to winning a lot of championships and winning races. And I consider him to be the best ever because of what he did for the sport. He grew Richard Childress Racing, made that team greater than what they ended up being in the future. And I think that Dale Sr. 1000% without question is the greatest driver to ever race in the sport. Sure, Jimmy Johnson and Richard Petty and drivers like David Pearson and Jeff Gordon were absolutely great what they did. There's no denying that. They're absolute legends too. But I think 1000% without question, you've got to have Dale Sr. as number one for this year. He's number one in my opinion. He's a legend. He's a great, and he absolutely deserves to be on the list. And for 2024, I have Dale Sr. being your number one driver. I think he is for sure the greatest driver in NASCAR Cup Series competition. I think he's the best driver to ever race in this sport. So, those are the top 100 greatest. Now let's talk about some honorable mentions that did not make the list this year. The first driver is Austin Dillon. Austin Dillon made the list last year. I didn't put him on the list this year for one reason. While he does have 4 wins and he meets the qualifications there, Austin Dillon doesn't have a lot of really great performances outside of that. Yes, he did win Daytona and won the Coke 600, but I couldn't put him on the list this year because I just don't trust Austin Dillon enough to be on a list like this. I mean, if he gets another win, he'll more likely be on the list, but for now, I don't have him on the list. Lloyd Dane did not make the list this year either. He had 4 wins, but he won a lot of early races, and I kind of take that into consideration, and there really wasn't an impact from him. So I'm going to say Lloyd Dane didn't make it because there wasn't a ton of impact from him. Eddie Gray, also I think had him on the list last year, nearly had him on the list. He won some races in the 50s and 60s. There's no denying that. I think he won some races in the convertible series, but he just didn't have a ton of success outside of a couple of wins and didn't run a lot of races either, which is why I don't have Eddie Gray making the list this year because he didn't have a lot of success there. Eric Jones was a driver I was considering. He's got 3 wins, but Eric Jones hasn't won since the 2023 Southern 500, and Eric Jones just feels like I'm not sure if he's ever going to win a race again. If Jones starts winning a lot more races, I will consider him to put him on the list in the future, but I consider him putting him on there, but Eric Jones currently number 4. Bubba Wallace is going to get a lot of people questioning me, but I think Bubba Wallace is getting close to that record. He's got 2 wins in Cup. I think he will be on there in the future. I think he will win races, but I couldn't put him on it this year because I think a lot of people have been questioning me for that, even though I think Bubba is almost considerably a top 100 great in NASCAR Cup competition. Red Byron, he's the original champion, but he only won 2 races. And I will say this about Red Byron, he's a good driver, a legend of the sport in certain instances, but I got to put Red Byron 100% off there because I don't think Red Byron deserved to be on the list this year. Elliott Sadler, he had 3 wins in Cup, was good in 2004, but didn't win more than that. I can't put Elliott Sadler on the list because he only won 3 races. I was considering putting him on there, but I couldn't put him on the list for 2024, but he could be on the list next year, depending on different criteria. Next, you got Ricky Stenhouse Jr. If Stenhouse gets another win, I'll consider him, but I'm not sure if I'm going to put him on there. He has a Daytona 500 win, but I can't put him officially on there yet because he only has that Daytona 500 win that could help him. Eric Almirola, well, yes, he's got 3 wins. They're kind of questionable, some of them, in my opinion. You could argue some of them are questionable for sure. If he had another win, I consider it, but he really wasn't great at other times for sure. So I'm going to have him, unfortunately, off the list. He did not make it this year. Robbie Gordon. Robbie Gordon I was considering because he was a great road course racer, and I think road courses do make a lot of sense to put on there, but I can't put Robbie Gordon on the list this year because Robbie Gordon just only won a few races. Then you got AJ Allmendinger. 3 wins, great road racer. If he wins another one this year, I think he will be a consideration, but I don't have him on the list for 2024 because he only has 3 victories. Shane Van Gisbergen. I consider putting him in the top 100, but I think he needs to win more. If he wins more Cup races, he 1,000% for sure makes the list next year. I think Shane will be a consideration for sure in the future. I think by next year he'll have a few victories, and I think he'll be a consideration for the top 100. And then you have Cecil Gordon. Cecil Gordon, in my opinion, is the best driver never ever win a race. I think he absolutely in the future will go on this list for sure. I think, well, he would have been on the list in other years, but because of the fact he never won a Cup race, I can't put him on there, and there's too many good drivers that won races, so that's why I can't put Cecil Gordon on the list for this year. So, that is going to be it for the top 100 greatest NASCAR Cup drivers of all time. I want to thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, notifications on, so if I win a video, it does go live on my channel. Follow my Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and support my Patreon as well. Let's go below that. Comment your thoughts below on today's video. Who do you think is the greatest NASCAR Cup driver of all time? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Tomorrow on the channel, we'll have a NASCAR news video or something else. If not, we'll have schedule predictions for 2025. If we don't have a NASCAR news video, probably won't see it until Monday. And there's a lot of content dropping this weekend. We're going to have a video talking about Kyle Busch, and we'll have other content dropping this weekend that you'll probably be surprised about. So anyways, like I said, I want to thank you guys for watching today's episode, and I'll see you guys next time for more great, awesome NASCAR content and other motorsports content on the channel like this. Take care, everybody.